Welcome back to Park Ranger Files. We have 13 new submissions today from Appalachia. Let's start this video. Story 1. I grew up hiking. My dad had me on trails before I could ride a bike. I have a photograph somewhere of myself at age 4, sitting on a boulder in a pink windbreaker with mud on my boots, and the kind of expression on my face that says I was exactly where I was supposed to be. By the time I was in high school, I was doing solo day hikes in the Pisgah National Forest on weekends, out before my parents were awake, back in time for dinner, with a note on the kitchen counter telling them the general trailhead and the name of the route. We were that kind of family. The mountain was not a place to be afraid of. It was a place to go. I knew Pisgah the way most kids know their own neighborhood streets. I knew which ridgelines connected to which creek crossings were reliable after rain, and which ones turned into chest-deep crossings after a good storm, which parking areas filled up on holiday weekends with out-of-towners who didn't know the trailhead etiquette. I knew where the good viewpoints were that weren't on any signage, and where the bad ones were that always showed up in Instagram posts, because they looked more dramatic in photos than they were in person. I knew the way the light moved through specific hollows at specific times of year, the way the smell of the forest changed with elevation, the particular sound that the wind made on the high exposed ridgeline east of the Black Balsam Saddle. I had been hiking those trails for 23 years before anything unusual happened. 23 years of weekends and vacation days, and occasional weekday mornings when I could justify taking the time. 23 years of going out and coming back the same person who left, tired and satisfied and slightly dirty, with nothing more to report than the weather and the wildflowers and whether the river was running high. That familiarity is part of why what happened when I was 28 felt so deeply, specifically wrong. It wasn't just fear. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these things get framed. It wasn't a fear response that I'm now trying to construct a narrative around. It was something more precise and more disturbing than fear. It was a specific kind of vertigo that comes from being somewhere, absolutely and suddenly not recognizing it at all. Like walking into a room you've been in every day of your life and finding the furniture has moved, except you're the furniture and the room itself has moved instead. It was October, a Tuesday, which meant the trails would be quiet. The weekend hikers would be gone. The serious through hikers mostly through for the season, and I'd have the whole route more or less to myself. I parked at a trailhead I had used probably 40 or 50 times, and started up a loop route I could have walked in my sleep. 9 miles. I'd done it in spring mud and summer heat and early winter with snow on the high sections. I'd done it with a bad knee and a heavier than necessary pack, and once with a head cold bad enough that I probably should have stayed home. There was no version of that trail I didn't know. The plan was a simple loop, ending back at the car by early afternoon, followed by a hot shower and a very large meal, because that's what a 9-mile loop earns you. The first 4 miles were fine. The leaves were a peak color. And I don't use that phrase loosely because peak color in Pisgah in mid-October is not a casual thing. It is a specific and almost aggressive beauty. The whole forest lit up from the inside like someone had replaced the canopy with stained glass. The light through the canopy was doing that thing it does in October where everything looks slightly unreal, like the saturation of the world has been turned up just past the point of comfort, where you keep looking at things because you almost can't believe they look like that. I remember feeling grateful for it in a way I rarely let myself feel grateful for things, a kind of uncomplicated happiness that I sometimes forget is available to me, that you forget to notice until you're sitting in your car on the drive home, and you realize you've been carrying it around all day without registering it. That was the first 4 miles. Easy, full, good. Somewhere around the 4-mile mark is where the trail curves around a long, rocky outcropping and starts climbing toward a saddle between 2 ridges. It's a specific curve I've walked hundreds of times. The rock on the right side of the trail has a particular shape to it. A long, low slab with a diagonal crack running through it that collects water in wet weather and dries out to a white line in summer. I've stepped over the route that crosses the trail 12 inches before that crack so many times that my left foot does it automatically. A learned memory in the body rather than the mind. I rounded that curve and the trail went in a direction I didn't recognize. I stopped walking immediately. My feet stopped before I had consciously decided to stop, which tells you something about how hard that wrongness registered. I stood there and looked at the trail ahead of me. Then I looked back at the trail behind me, which was the same trail I had been on all morning. The same route, the same crack in the slab, the same composition of forest on both sides. Then I looked forward again. The trail continued, but it went wrong. The grade was wrong. The way the path bent as it climbed was wrong. The trees on the right side were wrong, not wrong species exactly, but wrong placement, wrong density, wrong feel. Most wrong of all, there should have been a boulder field visible on the slope above the saddle. It was a distinctive feature, a long fan of broken stone that sat on the hillside, like a river frozen mid-flow, visible from the trail for nearly half a mile before you reached it. I had used it as a navigational landmark on every trip through that section. It had always been exactly where it was supposed to be. There was no boulder field. There was just dense, continuous forest running straight up the hillside, uninterrupted, as if the field had never existed at all. My first thought was that I had somehow gotten turned around, which made no logical sense because the sun was exactly where it should have been for the time of day. Southeast and climbing, just where mid-October morning puts it. My second thought was that I had taken a wrong turn somewhere earlier on the trail, stepped off on a side path or an unmarked spur without noticing. But I knew this route. I knew every junction on it, and there was nothing to step off onto in the first 5 miles that would have led me here, to a place that looked like my trail but wasn't. I stood there and went through it systematically, the way you do when something doesn't add up, and you're trying to find the calculation error. I went through it 3 times and couldn't find a version that made sense. I decided to keep moving forward, reasoning or attempting to reason that the trail was the trail and would eventually look familiar again. The way a word looks strange if you stare at it long enough, but resolves back into itself if you just read past it. That was the wrong call. I know that now. At the time, it felt like the rational choice. I had been on this trail hundreds of times. The trail was here. I was on it. I would keep walking and it would look right again. After maybe a quarter mile of walking through landscape that continued to feel just slightly wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate. The angle of the light through the trees, the sound of the wind in the canopy, the quality of the silence underneath those sounds. The trail ended. Not at a viewpoint, not at a junction with another trail, not at a designated campsite or a scramble route up to a summit. The path simply tapered down to nothing, growing narrower and less distinct with each step until I was standing in unremarkable forest, with no path visible in any direction and no clear indication of where to go next. The land around me was ordinary eastern hardwood forest. It was not dramatic. It was not frightening in any immediately identifiable way. It was just there, ordinary and pathless, looking back at me. I pulled out my phone. No service, which wasn't surprising. There are long stretches of Pisgah where you won't get a bar, and I knew that going in. But I had downloaded the offline topographic map before leaving the house, which is standard practice for me, and I opened it now and waited for it to load and locate me via GPS. According to the map, I was standing in the middle of a trail section, not at a junction, not near the end of anything. According to the map, there was clear, well-maintained path running directly through the spot where I was standing. The map showed trail. The ground showed no trail. I turned the phone to check if I'd misread my location on the screen, checked the scale, checked my orientation. The map was right. The ground was not matching it. I stood still for a long moment. I was doing the inventory that you do in that situation, checking my actual physical state, making sure I wasn't experiencing something medical, a sudden migraine aura, something else that might distort perception. I felt fine. My thoughts were clear. I was not confused in any internal sense. The external world was what wasn't making sense. That's when I noticed the quiet, not the peaceful kind, not the restful silence of an empty trail, which has its own texture. Birds in the canopy, squirrels working through the leaf litter, wind moving through the tops of the trees, the occasional sound of a branch cracking somewhere in the distance. That's what silence sounds like in Pisgah in October. What I was standing in was something else. It was actual quiet, a cessation of ambient sound so complete that for a moment I thought something had happened to my hearing. No birds, no wind, no rustling of any kind. The only sound was my own breathing, which suddenly seemed very loud. I have been on trails in all kinds of conditions. I have been on trails in dense fog, and in heavy snow, and in the dead heat of August, when nothing moves in the middle of the day. I have never, in 23 years of hiking in that forest, heard it that still. There are always birds. There are always squirrels. There's always something making noise in the leaf litter. Always some ambient biological activity in every direction. October especially. The squirrels are frantic. The migrating birds are moving through. The deer are starting to move for the rut. Pisgah in October is not quiet. It is full. It always has been. I started back the way I'd come, moving faster than I probably should have on the uneven ground, because I was not being as careful about my footing as I would normally be. I was moving away from the silence, which sounds irrational when I put it like that, because silence isn't something you can move away from. But it didn't feel neutral. It felt pressurized, like something in the air around me was being held very tightly in place, like the forest had inhaled and hadn't exhaled yet, and whatever it was waiting to exhale, I didn't want to be there for it. I kept telling myself I was being irrational. I kept running through the reasonable explanations. A spur trail I'd stepped onto without noticing, a section of the trail that had been rerouted since my last visit, a GPS glitch on the offline map. I kept walking. The ground underfoot was the same ground I'd walked in on. The light was the same light, but the feeling was wrong, all the way back. The feeling of standing somewhere that didn't quite know I was in it, or was deciding whether it did. It took me close to an hour to find the section of trail that matched what I knew. Not an hour of sustained walking. It was maybe 2 miles, and I should have done it faster. But I stopped repeatedly to check the map, to orient myself against the sun, to look for landmarks. When I finally came around a bend and recognized the boulder field sitting exactly where it had always been on the hillside above the saddle, the relief was physical. My shoulders dropped. My breathing changed. I walked over to the nearest boulder, one I have probably walked past 100 times without looking at directly, and I put my hand flat on the surface of it, pressing my palm against the cold stone. I needed to feel that it was real. I need you to understand how strange it is to need to confirm that a rock is real. I've never needed that before. I needed it then. And then the birds came back. Not gradually, the way the ambient noise of a forest usually rises as you move through it. All at once, as if a switch had been thrown. One moment, silence. The next, the full sound of an October forest. Squirrels in the leaves, a nuthatch somewhere in the canopy, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, wind in the high branches, a complete and immediate resumption of everything that had been absent, as if someone had unmuted a room. I made it back to my car and sat in it without starting the engine for probably 20 minutes. Just sat there. Then I drove home and stood in my shower for a long time and didn't call anyone or tell anyone because I genuinely didn't know what I would say. I've been back to that trail twice since. Both times it has been exactly as I have always known it. The curve, the saddle, the boulder field exactly where it's supposed to be. The sound of the forest full and continuous and normal. There is no spur trail. There is no section of the path that leads where I ended up. I've looked carefully. Whatever happened that day, I can't find evidence of it in the physical landscape. And I've tried. The closest I've come to any kind of framework for understanding it is this. For approximately 90 minutes on a Tuesday in October, I was somewhere that was not where I was supposed to be. The trail I knew you went somewhere else. The forest I walked through was not in some way I cannot fully articulate. The same forest that was there before and has been there since. I have no idea what that means. I've read accounts of what some people call place displacement. Read about magnetic anomalies and optical illusions in mountain terrain and the effects of exhaustion and low blood sugar on spatial reasoning. And none of those explanations account for the boulder field that wasn't there, the trail that ended in the middle of where a trail should have been, or the sound of a living forest stopping all at once and then starting again. None of them account for the rock I had to touch to prove was real. I'm not claiming I know what happened. I'm claiming I don't, and that the not knowing is something I carry with me every time I go back up there. There's a specific quality to the disorientation I'm trying to describe, and I want to try again to get it right, because every time I tell this story, I feel like I'm not quite reaching it. It wasn't that I was lost. I know what it's like to be lost. I've been lost, properly lost, once years earlier in fog, on a different section of the Pisgah in November, when the visibility dropped to about 15 feet, and I ended up navigating by compass for 2 hours before the fog broke. Being lost is frightening, but it's a comprehensible kind of frightening. You're in a place, and you don't know where that place is relative to where you want to be. And the fear comes from the gap between those two things, from the distance between known and unknown, and the job is to close the gap. Navigation, bearing and pace count, and landmarks. The world remains coherent. The problem is solvable. What happened on that Tuesday in October was not that. The problem was not solvable with navigation, because navigation assumes you are in a coherent world that maps onto itself consistently. What I experienced was a world that didn't. I was in a place that I knew absolutely, and the place had stopped knowing me back. The relationship had gone asymmetrical in a way I had no tools for. I've since read accounts of people who describe similar experiences. The word that comes up is liminality, which is a word that originally referred to thresholds, to the spaces between states, to the specific quality of being in transition between one thing and another. I'm not claiming I understand what that word means in the context of what happened, but when I read those accounts, I recognize something. The quality of the wrongness, the way it feels more like a relational failure than a perceptual one. As if the problem is not in your eyes or your brain, but in the contract between you and the place you're in. The place has stopped holding up its end of something. The boulder field, not being where it was supposed to be, is the detail I keep coming back to, and I want to explain why. It's not just that it was a familiar landmark, and its absence was disorienting. It's that the boulder field is not the kind of thing that could simply not be there. It's a geological feature. A fan of displaced rock sitting on a hillside, the result of ancient frost action and slope processes. Something that has been in that exact configuration for hundreds or thousands of years, and will be in that configuration for hundreds or thousands more. It doesn't disappear, it doesn't relocate, it exists. The hillside above the saddle was forested. I'm not describing a hillside with a gap where the boulders should have been, or a hillside where the boulders had been removed or covered. I'm describing a hillside with forest on it, continuous forest, as if the boulder field had never existed, as if the geological process that produced it had not occurred, as if I was looking at a version of the hillside that predated whatever happened to create the feature I've been navigating by for 20 years. I've looked for explanations that account for that specific detail. I've found none. Every explanation that accounts for how I could have gotten onto a wrong trail or wrong ridge fails against the boulder field, because there is no wrong trail in that area that leads to a hillside that resembles that hillside without having the boulder field on it. The boulder field is a singular feature. There isn't a similar hillside in the area that lacks it. I wasn't on a similar hillside. I was on the same hillside without the boulder field, which is an impossibility that I've been sitting with for several years now. The silence. I keep coming back to the silence too. I've described it as pressurized, and I've tried to think about whether that word is accurate or just evocative. I think it's both. What I mean by pressurized is this. The silence felt active rather than passive. Ordinary silence is the absence of sound. A neutral state, the background against which sound is measured. What I experienced in those 90 minutes was not a neutral state. It felt like something being held in place, something being maintained, the way pressure is maintained in a sealed container. And when I got back to the section of trail, I recognized and the sounds came back. All at once, immediately, the cessation of that feeling was as physical as the feeling itself had been. Something released. Something had been holding, and then it wasn't anymore. I have told this story to 4 people I trust. A close friend who hikes. My sister, who doesn't hike but who has a good logical mind. A therapist I was seeing at the time, in a session I'm sure she found memorable. And a geology professor I know, because I wanted to see if there was any mechanism by which a geological feature could be absent from a hillside in specific conditions. The hikers and my sister listened with the particular quality of attention that people give to something they're not sure how to respond to, neither dismissing it nor fully accepting it, waiting to see what I needed from the telling. The therapist suggested it might have been a dissociative episode and offered some literature on the subject, which I read and found plausible in general, but not in this specific case, because dissociative episodes don't leave physical marks. The topo map disagreed with the terrain. The geology professor told me that geological features don't disappear and reappear on 90-minute timescales. I told her I was aware of that, and that was precisely why I was asking. None of them could account for the boulder field. I've been back to that trail many times since the experience. Many times. I've stood at the curve and looked at the saddle and the hillside above it, and the boulder field has always been exactly where it's supposed to be. I've put my hand on those rocks. I've studied them. I've tried to understand, in the physical presence of the feature, how its absence was possible. I haven't managed it. The rocks are there. They're solid. They're the same rocks they've always been, worn smooth on the top surfaces where decades of hikers have sat on them, and rough on the undersides where they rest against each other on the hillside. The rocks were not there. And then I found the trail again, and they were. And I needed to touch one to know that they were real. That's the part I still can't fully square. Not the absence of the rocks, but the needing to touch one. The doubt about reality that required physical confirmation. The world had, for 90 minutes, stopped being reliable in a way that made me uncertain about what was real in it. The rock that I pressed my palm against was doing double duty. It was a landmark, and it was proof. It was solid, it was cold, it was there. The fact that I needed that proof tells me something about what the previous 90 minutes had cost me. I'm not sure I've fully gotten that cost back. Story 2. I want to start by saying that I am, by nature and by training, a skeptic. This is not a personality trait I'm apologizing for or qualifying away at the outset. It's relevant context. I'm a structural engineer. I've spent 22 years in a field where the difference between what you believe and what the numbers say can mean the difference between a building that stands and one that doesn't. I think in tolerances and load calculations and failure modes. I have a very low threshold for unexplained things, not because I'm closed-minded, but because in my experience, the unexplained is almost always the underexplained. There's a variable you haven't found yet, and when you find it, the whole thing resolves. I am submitting this because my brother has been after me too for 3 years, and because after 3 years of running every available variable against the experience and coming up empty, the fact that I'm still coming up empty bothers me more than the experience itself. An engineer who can't find the variable is an engineer who's missed something. I keep looking. I keep finding nothing. The short version of this is simple enough to put in a sentence. Something rode in my truck out of the Cherokee National Forest, and it was not there when I drove in. The longer version starts on a Friday evening in early November when I drove up into the Cherokee for a solo camping trip. I'm not a backcountry camper by nature. I do it 3 or 4 times a year, more as a deliberate reset than out of any deep love for sleeping on the ground. But I had a spot I liked near a tributary of the Tellico River, a site I'd used twice before with no issues. The drive in on the Forest Service Road takes about 40 minutes from the highway, and the last 10 minutes of it are rough enough that you need a high-clearance vehicle. Deep ruts, exposed rock, sections where the road narrows down to barely enough width for a full-size truck. I've driven worse, but not much worse. I parked at the end of the road, locked the truck, packed my gear into my frame pack, and hiked in about 2 miles to the site. Friday night, completely unremarkable. Cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes your sleeping bag feel like a reward rather than just insulation. I slept well, which I don't always manage in camp, and woke up feeling rested. Saturday, I hiked around the tributary drainage, ate well, read for a few hours in the sun, did the kind of low-effort outdoor day that you feel slightly guilty about until you realize that the absence of agenda is the point. Saturday night, I read myself to sleep at a reasonable hour. Sunday morning, I woke up, broke down camp methodically, packed out without any issues, and loaded my gear into the truck. All of this is routine. I want to be thorough about how routine it all was, because the thing that happened against a background of complete and unremarkable normalcy. And I think that matters. Whatever variable I'm looking for, it isn't a context of strangeness. Everything was completely fine, right up until it wasn't. The drive out on the Forest Service Road is slow. I run it in low-range four-wheel drive to protect the undercarriage on the worst sections, and even being careful, I probably average about 8 or 10 miles per hour on the bad stretches. The windows were up because it was in the low 30s outside and the heater was running. I had the radio off. No signal up there, and I tend to drive those forest roads without music anyway, because I like to pay attention to the road conditions. I'd been on the road for maybe 15 minutes, navigating a section of road I knew was particularly bad, when the smell hit at me. It came from behind me, from the rear of the cab, the back seat area. And it came on with a suddenness that had no prelude. One moment the truck smelled like cold air and coffee from my travel mug. And the next there was something else in the air that was immediate and overwhelming in the enclosed space, and I actually gagged. And that's not a thing that happens to me easily in the field. I've handled dead animals. I've worked in confined spaces with industrial odors. I have a high threshold for unpleasant smells. The closest comparison I can offer is a layered one. The primary element was animal musk, the kind of thick, dense organic smell that large mammals produce, particularly when stressed or during certain seasonal behaviors. Deer hunters will know what I mean. There's a quality to heavy animal musk in an enclosed space that is unlike anything in a domestic environment. Something ancient and biological that the body registers before the conscious mind does. But underneath that, and this is the part I've struggled to describe for 3 years, there was something else. Not a chemical smell, not anything I could place in a category. something that registered as organic but older than the musk. Not the smell of death exactly, because I know that smell and it wasn't that, but something in the same family. Heavy and stale and layered, like the smell of something that had been in a very old, very closed space for a very long time. I pulled over on the road, immediately without thinking much about it. I just pulled over and got out. I stood in the cold air and breathed, and then opened the rear door and looked into the back seat. Nothing there. My pack was loaded in the bed. The back seat was empty. I checked under the seat. I checked the footwells. Then I opened the tailgate and checked the bed. Nothing, just my pack and the gear that was the same gear I'd loaded that morning. I stood there in 30-degree air, with all 4 doors open, and the smell was still present inside the cab, strong enough that I could detect it even from a step back from the open door. Whatever had generated it was not visible. I let the truck air for 5, maybe 7 minutes. Got back in. The smell was diminished, still detectable but fading, and over the next 10 or 15 minutes as I drove, it faded to gone. By the time I reached the main Forest Service road, it was not there at all. Here's the problem. Not just one problem. There are 2, and together they eliminate the explanations that are otherwise available. The first, the windows had been up and the doors locked for the entire 15 minutes I'd been on the road before the smell appeared. There was no moment of opening, no possibility of wind carrying anything in from outside. Whatever produced the smell was either already in the truck when I started driving, or it entered a sealed vehicle while it was in motion. And the second option is not physically possible, so if it was already there, why didn't I smell it when I got in? I am not someone who fails to notice smells. The moment I sat in that truck on Sunday morning and put my pack in the bed, there was nothing unusual. The truck smelled like the truck. The second problem, when I stopped and checked, there was nothing there. No animal, no carcass, no biological material of any kind. No indication on the seat fabric or the carpet that anything had been present. If an animal had been in my truck, and my brother's best explanation is that a small animal got in during the night and exited when I checked, though he's never been able to say how, given the locked doors and closed windows, that animal would have left trace evidence. Smell of that intensity doesn't come from a clean source. I've driven that Forest Service road 11 times since. I've never smelled it again. I've never in my life smelled anything like it anywhere else. I keep running the variables. I keep finding the same gap, and the only explanations that are available. The smell appeared in a sealed vehicle with no identifiable source, and left without leaving any evidence that it had been there. I don't have a variable that closes that gap. 3 years later, I still don't have one. Story 3. I do trail maintenance as a volunteer. Have for about 6 years now, and I want to explain why that matters before I get into the experience itself, because the context is the point. Trail maintenance is not glamorous work. Most people who volunteer for it do a season and then drift away, because it turns out that clearing blowdowns and resetting water bars in the rain is less appealing in practice than it sounds in theory. I stayed, and I've kept staying, not because I have unusual tolerance for unglamorous work, but because there is something about the relationship it builds with a section of trail that I found nowhere else. When you maintain a trail, you stop being a visitor to it. You become responsible for it in a way that changes how you move through it and what you pay attention to. You start knowing it the way you know a room in your own house. Not just the general layout, but the details that only emerge from repeated presence. The crack in the ceiling that gets worse in wet weather. The door that sticks in summer but not in winter. The particular sound the floor makes at 3 a.m. The section I maintain runs through a stretch of the Jefferson National Forest, and the portion surrounding milepost 9 is the piece I know best. I've walked it in every season. Mud season in March, the dense green tunnel of July, the slow dying back of October, the skeletal winter forest in January, when you can see the ridgeline through the bare trees that the leaves hide all summer. I've walked it in rain, in snow, in the fog that sometimes sits in the hollows for days at a time in the colder months. I've done it at dawn with a headlamp still on, and I've done it in the last 30 minutes of light before I needed to be out. I know every boulder on that section by sight. I know the problem tree that's been slowly leaning over the trail for 2 years and will eventually need to come down. I know the spot where water runs across the tread after any rain of more than half an inch, and the spot where it pools instead of runs, and why that is. I know which way the wildflowers face on the south exposed sections and which animals use the muddy stretch near the seep as a crossing point. I know milepost 9 the way I know my own kitchen, which is why I can say with complete certainty that what I saw there on a Wednesday morning in late March was not something that belonged. I had started at the northern terminus of my section around 7 in the morning. There had been a significant windstorm the previous week, the kind that runs through the mountains fast and leaves a wake of debris that can take the better part of a day to clear if the damage is spread across a long section. I'd been warned by another volunteer that there was blowdown at several points, and I'd come prepared. Chainsaw for anything over 6 inches diameter, loppers for the smaller stuff. My full kit, because days like that tend to expand unexpectedly. I started work at the north end and moved south, clearing as I went, flagging anything I'd need to come back for. The morning was cold and clear, the particular kind of clear you get in the mountains in late March, when winter is technically over, but hasn't fully conceded. The leaf litter from the previous fall was sodden and matted down, still brown but with the first suggestions of green beginning to push through at the edges of things. I had my hands full for most of the morning. There were 2 significant blowdowns that required the saw and a lot of finesse to clear safely without damaging the surrounding vegetation, plus a section of tread that had heaved badly over the winter and needed resetting. By the time I got to the milepost 9 marker, I was tired. Not dangerously tired, but the kind of tired where you've been working hard in cold air for several hours, and your attention has started to narrow down to the immediate task. The marker's at a specific point in the trail where it comes out of heavy, dense tree cover and crosses a small open area, maybe 50 yards across, before ducking back into the forest on the far side. In summer, that clearing is tight and green, hemmed in by vegetation on all sides. In late March, with the leaves still down, you can see across it clearly and for a decent distance into the trees on the other side. I came out of the tree line and looked across, as you do when you emerge from closed forest into open space. It's a natural response. The eye goes where it can go after being hemmed in. And I saw a person standing at the far edge of the clearing, right at the point where the trail re-entered the forest, standing at the tree line, facing me. My first thought was simply hiker, nothing unusual about that. The trail is open to hikers, and even in late March there are people on it, particularly on weekdays when the ones who can take time off do. I'd seen hikers on that section before on winter maintenance days. My hand went up automatically in the trail greeting. Just a raised palm, the universal acknowledgement. The figure did not respond. That was the first wrong thing. Not a major wrong thing, not alarming by itself. Some people don't want interaction on the trail and don't wave back, and that's their right. But something else made me stop walking before I'd fully processed what that something else was. I stood in the middle of the clearing and looked at the figure at the tree line and tried to understand what was making my body reluctant to continue walking toward it. It was the stillness. The figure was completely still in a way that hikers, even resting hikers, simply aren't. People are constantly making small movements, shifting weight, adjusting a pack strap, turning the head slightly. Even at rest, the human body moves. This figure was not moving. At all. Not a small shift of weight, not a turn of the head. It was standing at the tree line, with the quality of stillness that belongs to a tree or a rock. And it was shaped like a person. And it was dark. Uniformly. Completely dark. Not dark clothing. I mean, there was no color to it at all in the visual sense. No color from a jacket, no backpack profile creating a distinctive silhouette, no definition to the face or hands. Just a dark, person-shaped form standing at the tree line at approximately 60 yards, maintaining that absolute stillness. I kept walking toward it because the trail went through that spot and I had no reason to change my course, and because part of me was still in the mode of reasonable explanation. It was a person in dark hiking gear, standing still for a moment, who hadn't noticed me. As I got closer, I kept expecting the figure to resolve into detail. That's what happens when you approach a person across a distance. The dark shape becomes a jacket color, becomes a face, becomes a set of particular features belonging to a particular individual who has a day planned and a car at a trailhead and probably a granola bar in their pocket. That's the normal progression of approaching a person across an open space. That did not happen. I got to 30 yards and the figure was not clearer. I got to 30 yards and it was still completely dark. Still completely still. Still without any definition or texture or color. Still just the shape of a standing person with no detail available. At 30 yards, I should have been able to see a face. I should have been able to read the specific color of whatever they were wearing. I should have been able to see whether they had a pack on. I couldn't see any of it. The figure was as visually undefined at 30 yards as it had been at 60. I stopped. I don't know exactly why I stopped at 30 yards rather than continuing toward it. I wasn't fully conscious of making the decision. My body stopped walking and I stood there in the clearing and looked at the figure, and the figure looked, or appeared to look, or was positioned to look at me. 20 seconds, maybe 30. I was counting my breathing. Then I looked down at my boot. I don't know why. Some nervous impulse, some need to look at something that was definitely there and definitely normal. I looked at my boot and then I looked back up and the clearing was empty. The far edge of the opening was unoccupied. The trail re-entered the forest there exactly as it always had, between the two large beeches that framed the entry point, and there was nothing between them. No figure, no person, no movement that I could detect in the trees beyond the entry point. I had not heard anything. That was what I kept coming back to as I stood there in the middle of the clearing, trying to process what I was looking at. The leaf litter at that end of the clearing was deep and matted and wet. Late March in those mountains, everything is saturated. Movement through that litter would have been audible from where I was standing. You cannot move quietly through wet, deep leaf litter. You cannot simply step into the forest through that entry without making sound. I had heard nothing. Not a crunch, not a rustle, not the small sounds of someone stepping through vegetation. One moment the figure was there. The next, between a downward glance and an upward one, it was gone. I crossed to the far edge and checked both directions on the trail as it entered the trees. Nothing visible, nothing audible. I pushed a few feet into the forest on either side of the entry point. The leaf litter was completely undisturbed. No compressed footprints, no disturbed layers, nothing that looked like a person had walked through there. If someone had left, they had left without touching the ground. I did not finish my maintenance section that day. For the first time in 6 years of volunteering, I flagged the remaining work as incomplete in my log and hiked out without finishing. It was not a decision driven by fear exactly, or not only by fear. It was more that I felt very strongly that the correct thing to do was to leave. And I have learned in my years of spending time alone in remote terrain to take that feeling seriously when it arrives. The trail would wait. The blowdowns would still be there next week. I've been back to that section many times since, dozens of times. I've crossed that clearing and passed that milepost 9 marker in all seasons and all weathers, and I have never seen anything like it again. The figure has not returned, or if it has returned when I was not there to see it. The trail is the trail. The clearing is the clearing. The beaches that frame the entry point are exactly where they've always been. I don't think about it every time I go out to that section anymore, but I think about it sometimes, particularly when I come out of the tree cover and the clearing opens up in front of me and the eye goes to the far edge out of that same old reflex. And I look. I always look. And so far there's nothing there, but I always look. The thing I haven't talked about in the original submission, because I wasn't sure how to say it, is what it was like to look away. I've thought about it a lot. About the specific moment when I looked down at my boot. A completely involuntary action. Something my body did before my brain had formulated any intention. And the figure was gone when I'd looked back up. And I've thought about what that sequence of events implies, or seems to imply, about the relationship between my watching and the figure's presence. The obvious reading is coincidence. I looked away for a moment, and whatever it was left in that moment. That happens. Animals vanish when you blink. People step behind cover in the time it takes you to look down and look back up. The figure was gone when I looked back up because it left in the interval when my eyes were elsewhere, and that interval happened to coincide with the movement. But the feeling at the time was not that. The feeling at the time was that the looking away was necessary, that the figure couldn't leave while I was watching it, that it was being held in place by my observation, and when I released it, when I looked down involuntarily, as if something in me understood what was required, it was free to go. I can't tell if that's a real thing I perceived or a story I've constructed around a coincidence to make it feel more meaningful. That's the honest epistemic position. I've been in the field long enough to know that pattern recognition is not the same as pattern detection, that human minds construct meaning from sequences of events that may not be causally connected, that the experience of something feeling significant is not evidence that it is. I know all of this. And I still think about the moment I looked down. I still wonder whether something in me understood that looking away was the right thing to do. Whether some part of my brain that operates below language had figured out the terms of the encounter before my conscious mind had. After that day, I went home and looked through everything I could find on figure at the treeline sightings. Not the cryptid forums, not the paranormal YouTube channels, the older literature, folklore collections, ethnographic records, the accounts that serious researchers had gathered from communities in the Appalachian highlands before those communities changed beyond recognition. What I found surprised me, not because the accounts were unusual. I expected unusual accounts, but because so many of them contained the same specific detail that mine did. The figure standing at the interface between settled space and forest space, never fully crossing either way, simply occupying the threshold, always at times of transition, dusk, dawn, seasonal change, always still in a way that read as deliberate rather than passive, always gone before direct approach was completed. The threshold detail is the one that keeps snagging my professional attention. I study land as a vocation. I think about the relationship between human space and non-human space constantly, about the history of how communities drew that line and managed it and understood it. The figures that appear in the old accounts are always at the line, not on either side of it. They're at the edge of the managed and the unmanaged, the named and the unnamed, the claimed and the unclaimed, which is exactly where the figure at milepost 9 was. The trail, the managed, cleared, maintained, named linear passage through the landscape, opening up into a small managed clearing, and at the far edge of it, at the point where the management ends and the forest begins again, something standing, something at the threshold. I don't know what it means. I've been thinking about it for 6 years, and I don't know what it means. What I know is that the trail at milepost 9 is a threshold in the technical sense, a point of passage between two states of the land, and that whatever I saw was standing exactly at that threshold and not moving in either direction, not coming toward me, not retreating into the forest, just being at the edge of things. The trail maintenance note in my log for that day reads, "Incomplete. Flagged remaining section for next visit." That's the only official record. The figure at milepost 9 doesn't appear in any log that anyone else will ever read. It appears here. It appears in my memory every time I walk that section. And it appears if I let myself think about it fully, in the part of my understanding of that landscape that has permanently changed. I know that trail. I've maintained it for 6 years. I know where the threshold is, and I know that something was standing there on a March morning and that when I looked away, it was released. Story 4. My cousin and I have been doing camping trips together since we were teenagers. We're both in our mid-30s now, which means we've had roughly 20 years of practice at the kind of low-stakes outdoor adventure that neither of us would call serious backcountry, but that we take seriously in our own way. We've tent camped, hammock camped, car camped, done short backpacking trips when we're feeling ambitious, and canoe float trips when we're not. The float camping idea came from a piece I read about the Ocoee River drainage, about how if you get below the whitewater sections, the river flattens into something entirely manageable on inflatable kayaks. And if you time it right in early fall when the water's lower and the air is still warm enough to make camping comfortable, you can string together 2 or 3 days of paddling and gravel bar camping that feels genuinely remote even though you're in a relatively well-known watershed. We'd done the trip once before, the previous September, and it had gone perfectly. We knew what to bring and what to leave at home. We knew roughly what mileage to expect per day on the flat sections. We knew which gravel bars tended to be wide enough and dry enough for a camp. We were going back to do it again, this time for 2 nights instead of 1, and we had a specific section of river in mind that we'd scouted on the previous trip and filed away for later. The put-in on the first day went smoothly. We covered about 8 miles before the lights started going golden, and we started looking for a place to pull out. Found a good gravel bar. Wide, flat, well-drained, with a line of sycamores above the high water mark that would break any wind coming down the river corridor. Good camp. We made dinner on a small camp stove rather than a fire because the wood on the bar was wet and we were tired and neither of us felt like fighting with kindling. We ate and sat in our folding chairs in the dark listening to the river, which is one of the best sounds there is for sleeping, and we went to bed early. Second day was a good paddling day. We covered more miles than planned because we were moving well and the water was pushing just enough to help. By mid-afternoon, we'd found the second camp spot, a wide gravel bar on a bend in the river with a backwater eddy on the upstream end where the current had carved a small, quiet pool off the main channel. The eddy was maybe 30 feet across at its widest, protected from the main current by a low gravel finger, and the water in it was calm enough to reflect the tree line above. Beautiful camp. We'd been eyeing it from the river for 200 yards before we pulled in. We made a fire that night. The wood on this bar was drier than the previous nights, and we'd found enough above the waterline to get something going without too much effort. My cousin is better at fires than I am, and he had it going well before dark. We had our chairs pulled up close, and we were in that mode that camping puts you in. Not really talking much, not doing much, just existing in the space. The river was audible from the main channel, a low, continuous sound, but the eddy beside us was completely still. The fire was doing what fires do at that stage, burning down to coals, giving off a lot of heat and not much light, the kind of fire you sit beside rather than look at. My cousin said, "Hey, what's that?" in the same tone he'd used to point out an interesting bird. Not alarmed, just noticing. I looked over at the eddy. Under the surface of the water, maybe a foot down from the surface film, there was a light. My first instinct was to rationalize it immediately, which I think says something about how disorienting the experience was. From the first moment, I thought, firelight reflected in the surface. But I looked at the geometry of it. The fire was to our left and slightly behind us, and what I was seeing was coming up through the water from below, not bouncing off the surface from above. The color was wrong for firelight, too. Our fire was orange and amber, the warm end of the spectrum. What I was looking at in the water was softer, slightly greenish white, like the color of a computer monitor in a dark room, or the color of bioluminescence in photographs I'd seen of ocean creatures. Except those photographs were ocean, and this was a freshwater river eddy in Tennessee. We both got up and walked to the edge of the eddy and looked down into the water. The gravel bar extended under the water to the edge of the pool and then dropped off into the deeper section, and the light was sitting on the bottom of the deeper section in probably 18 inches of water, not floating, not moving. Just sitting there on the gravel bottom, a soft, sustained glow with no visible source object. It was not a reflection of anything. It was originating from below the surface, from the gravel bottom, from the water itself, or from something on the water's bottom. My cousin wanted to reach in and get it, because my cousin is always the person who wants to reach in and get the thing that probably shouldn't be reached for. And that's been true since we were 9 years old. And he was the one who wanted to pick up the snake, and I was the one who said we shouldn't. His record on these calls is better than I'd like to admit, which is why I only said don't once, before I let him do what he was going to do anyway. He rolled up his sleeve to the shoulder and reached in. The water in the eddy was cold, not as cold as the main current, which had some thermal protection in that sheltered section, but cold enough that he made a small noise when his arm went under. He felt around on the bottom in the area where the light was. He said later he could see his hand moving through the glow, which I could confirm from where I was standing, because the light illuminated his hand and forearm as he moved through it. And he came up with nothing. Gravel, sand, a few small stones. He tried twice more, moving his hand in a wider arc, and each time came up with nothing but river bottom. The third reach disturbed the substrate enough that a small cloud of fine sediment lifted off the bottom and drifted outward through the water, and as it spread across the light source, the light went out. Not immediately, not all at once. It dimmed as the sediment cloud spread across it, the way a lamp dims if you drape something over the shade, and then went dark. We were both crouched at the water's edge looking into the black water with no light in it, and after a moment we stood up. My cousin looked at me. I looked at him. He said, "Huh," in exactly the tone you'd use if your car made a weird noise, and then stopped making it, not quite alarmed, but definitely filing it in the wrong column. We went back to the fire. Neither of us said much about it. We talked about other things and went to bed at a reasonable hour and paddled out the next morning in full daylight with the light of the eddy behaving exactly as water in sunlight does. Perfectly ordinary, completely unremarkable. I want to be specific about what it was not, because that's usually the first set of questions. It was not bioluminescence. I've done enough reading about this since the trip to say with confidence that bioluminescent organisms in Appalachian freshwater systems are not documented. The organisms that produce that effect are marine, overwhelmingly. Dinoflagellates, certain jellyfish, specific species of deepwater fish. The river systems draining the Cumberland Plateau and the Ocoee watershed do not have bioluminescent fauna. Whatever this was, that's not what it was. It was not a reflection. I've thought about the geometry of that repeatedly, and I can't construct an angle at which our fire, positioned to our left and behind us, relatively low and burning coals rather than high flames, could have produced a reflection in the water of the eddy that would have looked like what we saw. The color was also categorically wrong. Orange-amber fire does not reflect green-white on water, not under any atmospheric conditions I'm aware of. It was not a piece of hardware on the bottom of the eddy. My cousin's hand went over that bottom 3 times and felt nothing but natural substrate. There was no object there. The most common response when I tell this story is probably a beer can. I understand why people go there. It's the most available category, the most obvious ordinary explanation, and it lets the conversation continue without having to sit with something that doesn't resolve. But I was there. My cousin was there. We both looked into that water for several minutes from a distance of about 2 feet. We both saw a sustained, soft, greenish-white light originating from the bottom of the pool with no visible source object. He put his hand into it and felt nothing. It went out when the sediment disturbed it. These are the facts of what happened. I don't have a beer can explanation for them. I've been back to that stretch of river once since with a different group. We camped on the same general section, but not the same bar. I couldn't have found the exact spot again without more careful navigation than I did on the return trip. The river was the river. The eddies were eddies. Nothing was unusual. I've thought about what it might have been, on and off, for the better part of 2 years. The most honest thing I can say is that I don't have a category for it. I've described it as an unidentified light source to people who've asked, which is accurate and which satisfies no one, including me. What I keep coming back to is my cousin's hand moving through the glow, illuminated from below by something that wasn't there when he reached for it. The light going out under the sediment cloud, like something deciding it had been seen enough. If you're still here, go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. We put out new submissions every week, and there's genuinely a lot more where these came from. The submission queue right now is longer than it's ever been, which either says something about how many people are having strange experiences in these mountains, or about how many people have been sitting on something for years and finally feel ready to put it somewhere. Maybe both. Hit the bell too if you want them to actually show up in your feed, because apparently the algorithm buries these without it, which honestly feels appropriate given the subject matter. Story 5. You need some context before I get to what happened. Not because the context makes it more believable. I don't know that anything does, but because the context is part of why it still bothers me. Why it bothers me in a way that feels different from the way a scary story bothers you. A scary story you can put down. This is about a place I knew. I grew up in eastern Kentucky, and when I say that, I mean the deep version of it. The part of the state that took the interstate until the late 90s, and that still, even now, has a relationship with the outside world that is more conditional than the rest of the country. I'm talking about a town where the gas station is the only commercial establishment for 8 miles in any direction, and where everybody knows your family, going back 4 or 5 generations. Not because the community is small, it is, but that's not the reason. The reason is that the community has stayed. People don't leave much. They stay and they marry into other families that have stayed. And the whole thing knits together over time into something dense and specific that is not replicable elsewhere. My grandfather's family had land up in the hills outside of town. His grandfather had cleared part of it for farming, but the farming had stopped 2 generations back, and the land had been returning to forest for decades by the time I was a child. Creek running through the lower portion, where the ground flattened out enough to be workable. Mixed hardwood above that, and then higher up in the pockets between the ridges, old-growth timber that eastern Kentucky still carries in spots, if you know where to find it. The kind of forest where the canopy is high enough that the understory is shaded out and you can walk for a long way through it without pushing through undergrowth, just open forest floor and very large, very old trees. I spent a significant portion of my childhood on that land, not playing on it exactly. This wasn't a playground. It was more that I moved through it the way you move through your own house, freely and without planning, going where the interest took me. The creek was good fishing in spring and early summer. The higher portions were good for spotting deer and turkey in the early mornings. And in the upper part of the property, where the terrain got serious and 2 ridges came together and the land between them dropped into a narrow, shaded cleft, there was a hollow. Every property in eastern Kentucky has a hollow. That's not an observation, it's a geographical fact. The terrain folds that way. But this one was the hollow. What we called it when we talked about it. What I called it in my own head when I was a child. It was narrow and deeply shaded, cool even in the hottest weeks of summer, because the ridge walls blocked the direct sun for most of the day. A seep came out of the hillside near the upper end and ran down through the bottom of it, thin enough to step across at most points, but cold and clear year-round. It was the kind of place where the air smelled different. Not bad. Better, if anything. Cooler and damper and older than the air in the open forest. The way caves smell. I knew that hollow the way a child knows the inside of a beloved closet. Every stone, every tree. The way the seep ran wide in spring and narrowed to a trickle in August. The spots where the salamanders congregated under flat rocks at the water's edge. The hollow was mine in the way that a place is yours when you've given enough attention to it, when you've learned its particular language. When I was about 30, I went back. My grandfather had died the previous spring, and the property was going to be sold. There was no one in the family positioned to keep it, and keeping it had costs that the estate couldn't absorb. I drove up from Lexington on a Saturday morning in late August. I wanted to walk the land one more time before it went to someone who wouldn't know it. The lower meadow had grown up substantially. What had been a pasture was now head-high in goldenrod and Joe Pye weed, with young tulip poplars starting to push up through it. The first generation of trees reclaiming the open ground. I pushed through it to the creek crossing, which was higher than I remembered, and faster, pushing cold against my shins and filling my boots when I misjudged the crossing. Wringing my socks out on the far bank, looking up at the forest above me, I had a moment that I think happens to everyone at some version of this. The strange doubling of memory and present. The way a place you knew as a child occupies two scales simultaneously, and you can never quite make them register as the same thing. The hike up to the hollow was harder than I remembered. Steeper, or maybe I was just older, or maybe both. The forest was the same forest, near enough. The same species and roughly the same arrangement. The trunks bigger than I remembered, but that's just time. That's just what trees do. I was breathing harder than I expected by the time I got to the entrance of the hollow. The entrance is a specific point where the two ridges begin to converge and the terrain drops. You know you're at the entrance because the temperature drops by several degrees in the space of 20 steps and the light changes quality. It goes greener, more diffuse, filtered through the ridge walls and the dense canopy of the hollow itself. I'd felt that transition hundreds of times as a child, always with something close to relief, stepping out of the heat and into the cool. I felt it again, older and slightly out of breath, and for a moment, everything was exactly right. Then I saw the trees. I want to be careful about this part because it's the part people push back on most, and I want to be precise. I'm not a forester. I don't have a degree in botany or dendrology or anything adjacent to tree identification. But I'm a man who grew up on land in eastern Kentucky, who spent his childhood identifying trees with his grandfather, as a matter of course the way rural children do, who knows the species of the central Appalachians, the way you know the make and model of every car in your neighborhood, because you've been looking at them your whole life. Tulip poplar, red oak, white oak, beech, hickory, black walnut, sugar maple, basswood, sycamore along waterways. I know them. The trees inside the hollow were not trees I knew. I stopped at the entrance and looked in, and the trees at the near end of the hollow, the first ones visible, close enough to see in detail, were not species I recognized. Not exotic in the way a botanical garden is exotic, not obviously foreign. They looked like they could belong to the same general family as the trees I knew. But the leaf shape was wrong, not drastically wrong, not wrong enough that a non-botanist would necessarily clock it immediately, but wrong enough that I clocked it within 30 seconds of paying attention. The leaf margins were different. The bark texture was different. One tree in particular, a large specimen about 40 feet in on the left side, had a canopy structure I had no comparison for. The branching pattern was unusual in a way I couldn't fully articulate. The angles were slightly off, the secondary branch distribution slightly wrong, in a way that my eye kept snagging on even as I tried to think about something else. These were not trees that belonged in Kentucky. I don't know where they belonged. I just know they didn't belong there. I stepped into the hollow because I needed to be wrong. I needed to get closer and have the trees resolve into species I recognized, the way a face resolves into a known person as you approach across a distance. I walked 10 steps in, 20. The temperature dropped more sharply than I remembered, and the sound dropped too. A shift in the ambient audio of the world that I've now read about in other people's accounts and that I can only describe the same way they do. Not a gradual quiet, but a sudden one. The seep was still audible, running over stones in the bottom of the hollow. Everything else stopped. No insects, no birds, no wind in the trees above the ridge walls. The hollow was sealed. I was maybe 40 feet in when I heard the voice. It was not loud, it was not close, it was not addressing me. It was the sound of someone talking to themselves at a distance, or to someone else at a distance. The low conversational murmur of human speech without any of the words being distinct enough to catch. It came from somewhere deeper in the hollow, past the bend where the terrain curved out of my line of sight. The rhythm of it was completely human. It rose and fell the way a voice rises and falls in ordinary conversation. The pacing of it natural and unhurried, and it came and went in the way that sound does when you're hearing it around a corner or through a barrier. I stood still for a while and listened. I kept hoping to catch a word, something that would resolve the sound into something mundane. A hiker talking on a phone, a birder calling out a sighting to a companion. I caught nothing distinct. The voice continued for what I estimate was 2 or 3 minutes as I stood there, and then I turned around and walked out. Not quickly. I want to be honest about the pace because I've told this story and people always want to know if I ran, and the answer is no. I didn't run. I walked out at a steady pace that was slightly faster than my walking pace in. It didn't feel like something that would chase me. And this is the part that's hardest to explain. The voice didn't feel hostile. It didn't feel aware of me. It felt like something completely absorbed in its own concerns. Something that occupied that space in some way I couldn't characterize. Something that would no more have chased me than a river would chase someone who waded out of it. The lack of malice was almost worse than malice would have been. Malice implies a relationship, even if it's an adversarial one. What I felt coming out of the hollow was the absence of any relationship at all. I was not relevant, I was not acknowledged, I was barely there. I walked out of the hollow and down the ridge and through the growing up meadow and to my car, and I drove home. When the property sold 3 months later, there was a brief gathering of family members, just an hour at the farmhouse, and I didn't go. I told myself, it was the drive. It wasn't the drive. The voice I can almost talk myself out of. Sound carries strangely in hollow terrain, and someone in the forest on the far side of the ridge would have been out of sight, but not necessarily out of earshot. And a disembodied voice without a visible source is unsettling but explicable. I've argued both sides of this to myself for years, and I still don't know where I land on it. The trees I cannot argue myself out of. The trees are the thing I keep coming back to. I grew up on that land. I knew those trees the way I knew the rooms of my grandfather's house. The trees inside the hollow were not the trees I grew up with. They were not eastern Kentucky trees. Something in that narrow, shaded, cool cleft between two ridges was growing things that did not belong there, or was not growing things at all, but was showing me something that resembled trees without being them. And I have no framework for either of those possibilities, and I never have. I've been thinking about why I want to add to what I already submitted, and I think it's because the original submission ended with the trees, which is the most intellectually troubling part, but not with the part that is the most personally troubling part. The most personally troubling part is what I felt when I turned around and walked out of the hollow. I said in the original submission that it didn't feel like something that would chase me. That's true, but I want to try to describe what it did feel like, because I've thought about it a lot, and I think I can get closer to it now than I could in the first draft. When I was in the hollow, past the point where the temperature dropped and the sound dropped and the voice was coming from somewhere in the bend I hadn't yet gone around, the sensation I had was not fear in the usual sense. Fear is a relational thing. It assumes that you are relevant to what you're afraid of, that you are in a relationship with the source of the fear, even if that relationship is the relationship of prey to predator. Fear says, this thing has noticed me and intends me harm, or this thing might notice me and might intend me harm. It places you in the story. What I felt in the hollow was its opposite. I felt irrelevant. Not in the way that you feel irrelevant in the ordinary sense. Not the existential smallness of standing on a mountain and contemplating your own insignificance in the scale of geological time. That kind of irrelevance is actually very relational. It requires you to measure yourself against something enormous and find yourself small by comparison. What I felt was simpler and stranger than that. It was the absence of relation. Whatever was in the hollow was not measuring me at all. I was not a variable. I was not a presence that mattered in any direction. Not as a threat, not as prey, not as an interesting anomaly, not as anything. The hollow contained something that was fully occupied with whatever it was occupied with, and I was a momentary and entirely inconsequential passage through the edge of its world. That should be comforting. I've told myself many times since that it should be comforting. If it doesn't care about you, it's not going to hurt you. The mathematics of it seem to work out in a positive direction, but it is not comforting. I've tried to understand why it isn't, and the closest I've come to an answer is this: because being irrelevant to something that is clearly present and clearly doing something that has been there long enough to change the trees and alter the acoustic properties of the air. Being irrelevant to that is its own kind of confrontation with the limits of what I thought I knew about the world. It means the world is larger than I had believed, and larger in a direction that does not include me. That's not frightening the way a threat is frightening. It's frightening the way an abyss is frightening. You look into it, and the looking doesn't change it. It was there before you arrived, and it will be there after you leave. And your having been there will not register as having happened. My grandfather is the person I most wish I could ask about it. He knew that land. He knew the hollow specifically. We caught salamanders up there together when I was a child, and he'd been the one to show me the good spot under the flat rock at the edge of the seep, where they congregated in the wet months. He'd grown up on that property the same way I'd spent my childhood summers on it, except he'd grown up there fully and had worked it and hunted it and built parts of his identity out of his relationship with it. He knew things about it that he never articulated as knowledge, because they were so deeply absorbed that articulation wasn't necessary. I wonder if he knew about the hollow. I wonder if he'd been up there and felt what I felt or noticed what I noticed. I wonder if the trees had always been wrong, or only recently, or if recently is even a concept that applies to whatever has been in that hollow for however long it's been there. I can't ask him. He's been gone for 5 years. But I find myself returning to the thought of him knowing it, the thought of some piece of knowledge about that place existing in him that he never had occasion to pass on because nothing prompted the conversation. The knowledge dying with him because it never needed to be said while he was alive. The property has new owners. Somebody from out of state bought it. I don't know who. I hope they leave the hollow alone. I hope they're the kind of people who don't have a use for a steep, shaded, unworkable ravine with a seep at the bottom. The kind of people who let it be what it is. I hope they don't go up there with a plan for it. And I hope if they do go up there, they come back out. The trees bothered me more than anything else. I want to say that one more time. The voice I can work with. But a hollow in eastern Kentucky, with trees that don't belong in eastern Kentucky, that have been there long enough to grow to the size. I saw them. That's not a thing that happens. Trees don't appear in hollows. They grow there over decades and centuries from seeds that arrived there and found the conditions suitable and put down roots. Whatever those trees were, something brought them there, or something made them. And it did it over a time scale that makes me feel like the word recent means something very different in that hollow than it means anywhere else. Story 6. I'm going to keep this relatively concise because the experience itself was concise. I know there's an expectation with these submissions that you build up to the thing with a lot of scene setting, and I understand why that works narratively, but I've found that every time I tell this story with too much preamble, the telling starts to feel like it's building toward a climax that the actual experience didn't provide, and that misrepresents what it was like. What it was like was simple and contained and strange, and entirely without resolution. And the simplest way to convey that is to not dress it up. I'll give you the minimum context you need. I've been backpacking solo for 11 years. I started in my mid-20s when I moved to Western North Carolina for a job and realized that the mountains I now lived adjacent to were available to me in a way they hadn't been when I was growing up in the Piedmont. I've done hundreds of nights alone in the backcountry across several ranges, but the Linville Gorge Wilderness is home in the truest sense of the word. I know it the way some people know a city they've lived in for a decade. Not just the main routes, but the corners, the character, the way the light falls differently in different sections of it at different times of year. I'm not someone who gets scared in the backcountry. I'm not someone who lies awake at night listening for threats. I sleep well in the woods, I always have. On the night in question, I was 3 trips into a 4-day solo. It was my second night, which is always the best sleeping night on a longer trip. You've burned through whatever restless energy you brought from your regular life. Your body is tired from the first day's miles, and you're not yet counting down the remaining days the way you start to on the last day. I had a good campsite on a bench above the gorge, well sheltered, well positioned. I'd had a full dinner, filtered water for the morning, hung my food, done all the logistics. I was in my bag by 9 o'clock. I was asleep before 9:30. The gorge was quiet in the way the gorge is quiet, full of the sounds of the river below and the wind through the hemlocks above, which is a continuous sound that resolves into a kind of white noise when you've been listening to it long enough. I woke up completely. Not gradually, not in the way you ease out of sleep when you're rested and there's nothing requiring your immediate attention. Completely, all at once, the way you wake up when a loud sound has pulled you out of sleep. That sudden, full consciousness that arrives before you finished understanding what woke you. But there had been no sound. The gorge was exactly as it had been when I fell asleep. My tent was still. Nothing was pressing against the fabric. The wind was the same wind. I looked at my watch. 2:47 in the morning. I lay there for a moment and took inventory. This is a habit I've developed on solo trips as a way of short-circuiting the spiral of nighttime anxiety that can set in if you let it, taking stock of the actual present situation rather than the imagined one. Tent intact, bag warm, body fine. No sounds outside the normal register. The gorge was doing exactly what the gorge does at 2:47 in the morning in October. Something told me to look at the wall of my tent facing the gorge. Not a voice, not a sound, a pull. Something directional in the animal part of the brain that predates language and operates faster than thought. The same mechanism that turns your head toward movement in your peripheral vision before you know you've seen it. I looked at the tent wall facing the gorge. There was a handprint on it. A compression in the nylon from the outside, palm-sized. I could see the spread of the fingers, 4 of them, and the thumb, pressed flat against the fabric. Not a human child's print, not a shape, that might have been produced by anything other than a hand, arranged the way a hand arranges when it presses flat against a surface. A hand pressing against the outside wall of my tent, and the fabric was moving. This is the part I need to be precise about, because it's the part that distinguished this from a branch pressed against the tent by the wind or a rock that I had somehow not noticed when I pitched the site. The fabric was flexing with the slow, rhythmic pressure of something maintaining contact, not the random flutter of wind against nylon, but the specific give and return of nylon under a steady load. Something was holding its hand against the outside of my tent wall, and the pressure was ongoing. I did not move. I don't know for how long. My watch was in my hand because I just checked it and I didn't look at it again. So I have no precise accounting of the time. I can say it felt long. I lay flat on my back in my sleeping bag and I watched the hand-shaped depression in the nylon, and I breathed as slowly and deliberately as I could manage, because whatever was rational about my brain was telling me that staying still was correct, and whatever was not rational about it was contributing to the staying still by making moving seem impossible. The pressure released slowly. Over 30 seconds, maybe 45, the fabric went from fully loaded to flat. The handprint depression smoothed out. The nylon became ordinary nylon again, slack and unoccupied. And then it was just my tent and the sound of the gorge and 2:47 in the morning. I lay still until it was light. This is the part people most often express surprise at. That I didn't go outside, didn't investigate, didn't do anything. But I think if you've spent enough time solo in the backcountry, you understand the calculus of that moment. I was in a shelter. Whatever was outside was outside. Leaving the shelter to investigate in the dark made the shelter a place I'd left. Made me a person standing alone in darkness at 2:47 in the morning, investigating something I couldn't identify by going toward it. I stayed still. I waited for light. When it was fully light, I went outside. The site around my tent was a layer of soft, organic material over bedrock, the kind of substrate that accumulates in the sheltered spots on bench terrain, decades of leaf litter compressed into something between soil and duff. It holds impressions, but not reliably, and not well for something that made brief contact as opposed to something that stood in place. I found nothing clear. Depressions that could have been footprints or could have been irregular surface of the duff. Nothing that I would photograph and say, here. Here is what was outside my tent. The tent fabric itself was undamaged. No tear, no scuff. Just nylon. Same as it had always been. I packed out that morning instead of continuing the trip. I gave myself a reasonable explanation. I wasn't feeling well. I needed to get back early for something I'd remembered. I told myself these things and I packed out and I drove home, and I did not tell anyone what had happened for almost a year. Not because I thought no one would believe me, because I hadn't found a way to put it into a shape that felt like it honored what it actually was, which was this. Something put its hand against the wall of my tent at 2:47 in the morning in the Linville Gorge and held it there. And I felt the pressure of it through the nylon, and I have no idea what it was. I'm putting it on record now because I've decided that's the right thing to do with it. Not because I expect resolution. Not because I think someone reading this is going to send me the explanation. Just because it happened, and things that happened deserve to be said. The question I get most often when I tell this story is, what did it feel like? Not what did you do? Not what did it look like? What did it feel like to lie there in a sleeping bag at 2:47 in the morning, watching something press its hand against the outside of your tent? The honest answer is complicated, and I've been refining it for a while, so let me try. The first sensation was something I can only describe as a specific kind of clarity, not calm. I want to be clear that I'm not using clarity as a euphemism for calm, because I was not calm. What I mean is that my perception went very precise. the way that happens in moments of acute stress, where the brain allocates its resources differently, and the world narrows down to the relevant data and becomes highly detailed within that narrow frame. The handprint on the nylon, the way the fabric flexed, the sound of the gorge underneath everything, the river, the wind, and the hemlocks, unchanged, unalarmed, indifferent to what was happening at the tent wall. The indifference of the river is part of it. The gorge was the same gorge it always is at 2:47 in the morning. The sound of it was the sound it always makes. Whatever was pressing its hand against the outside of my tent was not alarming the gorge, was not alarming the hemlocks, was not producing any sound or disturbance that would have registered in the ambient audio of the environment. It was an extremely local event. It was happening specifically at the tent wall, and nowhere else in my sensory field was anything different. The second sensation, arriving shortly after the first, was the specific quality of the stillness I described before. The not moving. The assessment of not moving as the correct course of action. I've thought about where that assessment came from, and I think it came from the same place that the assessment comes from in any situation where movement might be costly and stillness is free. The basic calculus of uncertainty. I didn't know what was on the other side of that tent wall. I knew that it was pressing a hand, against the fabric. I knew that it was maintaining that pressure in a way that was deliberate and sustained, not accidental. I knew that it had not attempted to enter the tent. These were the data points available to me, and the course of action they suggested was to gather more data before taking any action that couldn't be undone. Lying still was the reversible choice. Getting up and opening the tent was not. What I didn't feel, and what surprises me more now than it did then, I didn't feel the impulse to speak, to call out, to ask who's there in the way that movies have trained us to expect someone will ask when something is outside the tent. I've wondered about that since. I think the honest answer is that on some level I knew, not rationally knew, but knew in the body, in the animal register. That asking was not going to help. That whatever was on the other side of the fabric was not something that would answer me, not something that the question, who's there, was designed to reach. It was not that kind of encounter. The question belonged to a different category of situation. I was not in that category. The pressure releasing was a physical sensation that I still remember clearly. The way you remember physical sensations that were associated with significant moments. The fabric going from loaded to flat. The nylon becoming slack against the poles. The absence of the shape. It was a relief that was indistinguishable from grief for a moment. I don't know how else to describe that. The relief that it was over, and the weight of the fact that it had happened, and that I would now have to carry knowing that it had happened. Both feelings arriving at the same time, in the same body, impossible to separate. I lay there until the light. I've described that before. What I haven't described is what I thought about during those hours. I thought for a long time about the fact that I was alone. I've been alone in the backcountry hundreds of times, and that aloneness has always felt like a resource. The thing that makes the experience available in its fullest form, unmediated by another person's experience of it. That night it felt like something else. Not like a deficit exactly, but like a condition. Like a state that had different implications than it usually did. I was alone, and something had been within arm's reach of me, and the only person who knew anything about it was me. That's still true. The only person who was there is still me. The recording of it exists in my memory and in this submission and nowhere else. This is why I submitted it. Not because I think anyone can explain it, not because I'm looking for validation or corroboration or company, but because having a thing exist in only one person is a precarious form of existence for it. And what happened at milepost 247 on that October night in the Linville Gorge deserves a more stable form of existence than that. It happened. It was real. I was there. Here's the record of it. The hand, the slow release, the flat nylon. 247. I still have the tent. I've used it many times since. I don't think about it most of the time when I set it up. But sometimes I'm lying in it in the dark in some other part of some other mountain range, and the wind shifts the fabric, and I watch the tent wall in the dark for a long moment before I go back to sleep. Just watching, just checking, just reminding myself of the difference between wind-moving nylon and something else moving it. Reminding myself that I know the difference, that I've felt both. Story 7. I've lived on the edge of the Cherokee National Forest my entire life. That's not a figure of speech. The house I grew up in is the house I live in now, having bought it from my parents when they moved to a smaller place in town. And the back boundary of the property has been the forest boundary for as long as anyone in my family can remember. The property sits where it sits, and the National Forest begins where it begins, and the 60 yards of yard between them has always been the same 60 yards. The same slope down toward the creek, the same cluster of old apple trees my grandfather planted, the same grass that needs cutting in summer, and the same frost patterns in winter. I've watched that tree line every day of my life. When you spend that kind of time looking at a particular piece of land, you develop a relationship with it that is impossible to fully explain to someone who hasn't had it. You don't just know what's there. You know the quality of what's there, the texture of it, the particular way it looks at different times of day and in different seasons and in different weather. You know what the tree line looks like in October when the leaves are going. You know what it looks like in February, when everything is bare and you can see 50 yards into the timber to where the terrain breaks. You know what it looks like at dusk when the light drops off the ridge and the shadows pool in the hollow below the property line. You know it the way a musician knows a piece of music they've played 10,000 times. Not consciously, not as a series of individual notes, but as a whole thing that lives in the body. I have watched that tree line every day for 41 years. I know exactly what belongs there and what doesn't. This started 3 years ago. Mid-October, early in the month, still warm enough that I had the windows open in the evenings. The good part of October, in East Tennessee, when you're past the oppressive summer heat, but not yet into the cold, when the air in the evening is just right and you want to sit on the porch for as long as there's light. I was sitting on the back porch around dusk, doing nothing in particular. My wife was inside. I had a glass of sweet tea and I was watching the last of the light go off the ridgeline and doing the kind of thinking that isn't really thinking, just letting the mind sit where it is. I noticed the figure at the tree line, the way you notice something when you're not looking for anything in particular. Peripherally, softly, without the full attention engaged. My eyes went to it, and it registered as a person-shaped form, standing at the edge of the trees, just inside the shadow line, where the open ground met the timber, far enough back that the detail was poor in the failing light. Far enough back that my first instinct, as it always is, was to dismiss it as a deer standing and watching the open ground. Deer don't register as people to me anymore, after 4 decades of watching them move through that tree line. My brain has categorized them correctly for too long to mistake them. But this one wasn't resolving into a deer. It was standing in a way deer don't stand. Too upright, too vertical. The silhouette too linear for the rounded-shouldered shape a deer makes when it's alert. And it was not moving. Not standing still the way a deer stands still when it's alert and evaluating. That stillness has a quality of potential energy to it. All the lines of the animal gathered toward potential motion. This was a different stillness. Passive. Settled. The stillness of something that had been standing there for some time and intended to continue. I watched it for a while without getting up. The light continued to drop. When it was fully dark, I went inside and didn't say anything about it because, at that point, I had nothing to say. Could have been a person. Could have been a deer at an angle I hadn't seen before. Could have been nothing at all. A pattern in the shadows that my brain had assembled into something from its repertoire of recognizable shapes. It was there the next night, same time, same spot, same absolute stillness for as long as I watched, which was longer this time, because now I was looking for it and finding it. I started keeping notes. Not formally, just notes in the margin of my pocket calendar. A small mark on the dates I saw it, a note of the approximate time. Over the following 2 weeks, I counted 11 separate evenings, always at dusk, always within a few yards of the same position. Not exactly the same position every time I noticed, but within a tight radius. Close enough that it was clearly returning to the same general location rather than appearing randomly across the tree line. Always stationary, always for as long as I was willing to watch, which was never as long as full dark because I'm 63 years old and my eyes don't adapt the way they used to, and I gave up after 20 or 30 minutes as a rule. I never saw it arrive. I never saw it leave. It was simply there, and then I was inside, and in the morning, there was nothing there. That bothered me. The arrival and departure were as mysterious as the presence itself. I've tried to imagine what it would look like to see it arrive. Something stepping out of the forest into its position at the tree line. Something moving through the timber toward the edge of the trees. I've tried to set up the right observation to catch the transition. I've never managed it. It was always already there when I noticed it. On the 12th night, I got the binoculars. The figure was there in its usual spot, and I raised the binoculars and brought them into focus, and the figure resolved into slightly more detail, though not as much as I hoped. At binocular distance, I should have been able to tell you whether it was a man or a woman, what color clothing they had on, whether they had a pack or a hood or any of the other specifics that distinguish one person standing in a tree line from another. What I got was this. It was upright, roughly human in proportion, and it appeared to be oriented toward my house. I could not see a face. I could not make out clothing color. It appeared uniformly dark. But that might have been the light conditions, and I'm not prepared to say it was the actual quality of the thing. It was looking my way. That's all I could say with any confidence. It stopped appearing after that stretch of evenings. 2 weeks with nothing, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the consistency, if memory had edited a few random sightings into a pattern that hadn't really been there. Then it came back, and this time the location was slightly different. It was closer, not dramatically closer, not something a person standing at the tree line and deciding to walk across the yard would produce. But the position was at the edge of the trees rather than inside them. It had moved, or a different thing was appearing in a slightly different position. I have no way to know which. I still have no way to know. I called my neighbor down the road, who I've hunted with for 20 years and whose judgment I trust. He came over on the next evening the figure appeared, and we stood on the porch together and watched it. He saw it. No equivocation, no, maybe I see it. He looked at the tree line and said quietly, "Yeah, I see it." We stood there for a while, not talking, and then he said he wanted to walk out to it. I told him I'd rather he didn't. He asked me why, and I thought about it for a moment, and told him I didn't know, just that I'd rather he didn't. And he said, okay, and we went inside. I've asked myself a lot of times since why I said that. I think the answer is that the thing at the tree line had been appearing for weeks and had not moved toward the house and had not done anything threatening, and the equilibrium of that felt, on some level, I couldn't fully articulate, like something I didn't want to disturb. Whatever terms existed between my property and the tree line, I didn't want to renegotiate them by sending someone out across the yard. Whether that instinct was wise or irrational, I still can't say. It still appears, less regularly than that first concentrated run of October evenings, but it comes back. Sometimes I go 2 or 3 weeks without seeing it. Then I'll be on the porch in the low light, and there it will be, in the general vicinity of its position, standing still. It has been there as recently as 4 months ago. My wife has seen it twice. Both times she saw it on her own before I pointed it out, and both times her description matched mine. We've talked about it a few times, and we've landed in the same place each time, which is that we don't know what it is, and we don't have a way to find out that doesn't involve doing something we're both unwilling to do. So we've learned to live around it. It shows up. It stands there. It goes away at some point during the night when we're not watching. The thing I find myself returning to is the question of what it wants, or whether it wants anything. Neither of the options available feels comfortable. If it wants something, I don't know what it is, and the not knowing is its own kind of unease. If it doesn't want anything. If it simply appears because it appears, with no more intention toward us than the trees behind it have toward us, then I'm not sure what to do with that. I've lived on the edge of these woods for 41 years. I thought I understood the terms. Whatever's standing at my tree line at dusk suggests I may not have understood them as completely as I believed. I'm not frightened. I want to be clear about that because I know how these accounts get read and I don't want to overstate the emotional register. I'm not frightened. I'm uncertain in a way I wasn't before 3 years ago, and the uncertainty has not resolved, and I don't expect it to. I've accepted that this is part of what it is to live here. The figure at the tree line is part of the landscape now. I don't know what it is, I know where to look for it. And those two things have never been further apart in my experience of the world I live in. 3 winters ago, my wife asked me something that I've thought about many times since. We were sitting in the kitchen after dinner, and she asked me, not unkindly, whether I thought we should move. She framed it carefully. Not because of the thing at the tree line, because we don't talk about it in those explicit terms. She framed it as a general question about whether we were still where we wanted to be, whether the house still felt like home. I told her, yes, we're still here. I've examined that answer for 3 winters. I think it's the right answer. Not because the figure at the tree line doesn't trouble me. It does, it has from the first night I noticed it. It continues to in a quiet, ongoing way that I've come to understand as permanent. But because leaving is not the appropriate response to a thing that has, over 3 years of appearing at my property boundary, shown no intention of closing the distance. It stands where it stands. It has never come to the door. It has never come to the apple trees. It stays at the edge, always at the edge. And the edge is where it belongs. There's a version of this story where I'm a man who was frightened by something at his tree line and eventually sold his house. I've imagined that version. I've imagined driving away with the truck loaded and looking in the rearview mirror at the property as we went down the road and wondering if the figure would be at the tree line as we left, watching the spot as long as it was visible. That version of the story has a completeness to it, a definitive ending, a before and after. This version doesn't. This version is ongoing. The figure comes and stands and leaves and comes again, and I sit on my porch and watch it, and my wife sees it sometimes, and we've learned to live around it. The ending of this story hasn't happened yet, because the story hasn't ended. I've started noticing things I didn't notice in the first year. Small things or things that might be nothing and might be something. The figure appears more often in certain seasons. October and early November primarily, with occasional appearances in late February and early March. The season of change both times. The transition from warmth to cold, the transition from cold to warmth. I've noted this in my pocket calendar, the same pocket calendar where I've been marking the appearances for 3 years. And the seasonal pattern is real. It's not dramatic. It's not absolute. The figure has appeared in July once that I saw clearly. But the tendency is there. I've also noticed that the figure doesn't appear the night before or after a storm. The nights of its appearance are quiet nights, still air, the kind of early dark that comes in October when the clouds are down. Not weather nights. I've thought about what that means. I can't work out an explanation for it, but I've noted it because I'm a person who notes things now when it comes to the figure at the tree line. I have been turned into a careful observer of a single location by 3 years of looking. My neighbor, the one who came over to watch with me on one of the evenings, he's moved since then, further out into the county. We still talk occasionally. He's asked about the figure a few times in the careful way that you ask about someone else's unusual situation. I always tell him it's still there sometimes. He always pauses before responding. I've decided that the pause is him deciding not to say what his first response was, deciding on the more considered response instead. I've never asked him what the first response was. I think I know. I think the first response is the same response most people have when they learn that something has been appearing at your tree line for 3 years. Why are you still there? The why is the 41 years. The why is the back porch and the apple trees and the 60 yards of yard and the ridge above the forest that catches the first light in the morning and holds it longer than anywhere else I've ever lived. The why is that this is where I live and this is where I intend to keep living, and whatever is at the tree line is at the tree line, not at my door. And until that changes, I see no reason to treat it as a reason to leave. Whatever it means, whatever it wants, whatever it is at my tree line, and I am in my house. And both of those things continue to be true. And I have made my peace with the fact that I cannot account for what is standing in the shadows at the edge of my property in the October dark, and that my peace with it and my accounting for it are two entirely separate things that don't require each other. Story 8. I am a wildlife biologist. I want to be specific about what that means before I say anything else, because the specificity matters for how you should weight what I'm about to tell you. I've spent 30 years in the field. 15 of those were dedicated primarily to ungulate behavior research in the mid-Atlantic Appalachians, white-tailed deer population dynamics, behavioral ecology during the rut, the effects of habitat fragmentation on movement patterns. My doctoral work was on deer distribution in relation to mast availability. I have spent thousands of hours in Appalachian forest at night, in all seasons, in all weather conditions, recording data. I have encountered every species present in those mountains. Black bears, many times and at close range. Coyotes at closer range than was always comfortable. Fisher cats, wild boar in the southern portions of my study area. Copperheads, timber rattlesnakes, great-horned owls at distances that have made me flinch. I know what these animals sound like. I know what they look like when they move. I know the sign they leave. I know, in more than a casual recreational sense, the fauna of the Appalachian forest. I am not someone who misidentifies wildlife sounds. I am not someone who mistakes mundane animal activity for something unusual. The reason I'm taking the time to establish this is that the thing I'm about to describe is the account of someone who has the professional background to know exactly what it was not, and who cannot tell you what it was. A colleague at my university, a fellow biologist in a different subfield, convinced me to submit this. She's had her own strange experiences in the field. She does herpetological work in cave systems. And she felt strongly that these kinds of anomalous field observations deserve to be recorded somewhere, even informally, because the formal literature has no mechanism for receiving them. She's right about that. If I put what I experienced into my field notes with my name on it, the professional consequences would be significant. So this is the informal record. Make of it what you will. 4 Novembers ago, I was conducting a solo overnight field survey in a section of the George Washington National Forest. I was there during a mast year, a biological cycle in which oak trees, responding to some combination of weather conditions and internal biological signals that ecologists still don't fully understand, produce an exceptional abundance of acorns. Mast years occur irregularly, roughly every 2 to 5 years, depending on the species and location, and they drive significant and measurable increases in wildlife activity. Bears hyperphage aggressively to build winter fat reserves. Deer congregate in areas of high acorn density. Turkeys, squirrels, and a variety of other species shift their distribution significantly in response. A mast year in Appalachian hardwood forest is one of the most active periods a field biologist can work in, and it's a period I've studied extensively. The survey was legitimate work. I had my research permits. I had camera traps deployed in the area from a previous visit, and the purpose of the overnight was to pull those cards and collect data on activity patterns in the mast year conditions. I had camped in the same general area before and had a preferred site on a southeast-facing bench that gave me good access to the camera trap positions without requiring a full breakdown and reset. The first night, entirely within expected parameters. Significant black bear sign attracts scat and considerable disturbance to the ground around the base of several productive oaks where bears had been rooting up acorns. Clear evidence of buck rub activity in a sapling stand that I noted as potentially useful for a future camera position. Nothing unusual. The stuff of a productive mast year survey. The second night is the account I'm submitting. I want to be precise about this, and I've thought carefully about how to describe the experience in terms that a layperson will understand, but that don't sacrifice accuracy. I was working in my tent around midnight, reviewing the camera trap footage on a laptop, which is something I do in the field to maximize efficiency, so that I can pull cards that haven't captured useful activity and redeploy those cameras to better positions on the same trip. The tent was lit by the laptop screen. The surrounding forest was quiet in the way that mid-November forest is quiet. Most of the songbird activity is done for the season. The summer insect chorus long over, the wind variable and not sustained. In those conditions, in that forest, sound carries very well. I'm aware of everything within a significant radius when I'm working in camp at night. You develop that awareness over years of fieldwork. You know when something changes? Something changed at approximately midnight. I put down the laptop and sat still and listened. There was a vocalization coming from approximately 100 meters to the northeast of my campsite. I estimated the distance from the quality of the sound. Experienced fieldworkers develop a calibration for distance and direction over time, and while I wouldn't put this estimate in a paper, I'm confident about the 100-meter approximation within a margin of 30 or 40 meters either way. The first thing I assessed was size. Bioacoustics is an area I've worked in adjacent to my primary research, and one of the things you learn quickly is that the volume and resonance of an animal's vocalization correlates with body size in specific ways. The harmonic depth of a sound, the richness of the overtones, the frequency of the fundamental, tells you something about the size of the resonating chamber, which tells you something about the animal. What I was hearing suggested a large animal, significantly large. In a context where the largest animal I'd expect to encounter was a black bear, this was at the upper range of what a bear could produce, or beyond it. But the structure was completely wrong for a bear vocalization. I know the black bear call repertoire as well as anyone working in this region. It's limited and well documented. Huffing and jaw-popping as threat displays, moaning vocalizations when stressed, or as a maternal behavior, a variety of huffing and blowing sounds. None of these match what I was hearing. I went through the other large mammals, elk, which are not present in Virginia, but whose calls I know from other fieldwork. Not a match. White-tailed deer, which produce a relatively limited range of sounds. Not a match. Wild boar, which produce grunts and squeals that are distinctive and unmistakable. Not a match. Coyote, which produces complex howling vocalizations that are also distinctive. Not a match. Nothing in the call repertoire of anything known to live in that section of forest was a match. What I was hearing had a rhythmic pulsing quality. It repeated at irregular intervals. Not the absolute regularity of a mechanical sound, not the entirely irregular pattern of random biological sounds, but something in between. Intervals that suggested an organism producing sound deliberately, with rhythm, the way vocalizations produced for a purpose, have rhythm. The fundamental frequency was low. I've estimated it in retrospect at somewhere in the 80 to 120 hertz range, though I can't be precise without the recording and analysis equipment I didn't have with me. The overtone structure was complex in a way that I found genuinely difficult to characterize, which is not something I say lightly. I've characterized a lot of animal vocalizations. I pulled out my phone and recorded it. I recorded approximately 8 minutes of the vocalization, which continued for roughly 12 minutes total before stopping. I heard no locomotion associated with it. No footfalls, no movement of vegetation, nothing to indicate that whatever was producing the sound was moving. It was stationary and vocalizing, and then it was silent. I did not go investigate in the dark. This is not a decision I need to justify to anyone with field experience. The following morning, I walked the area in the direction of the vocalization source as systematically as the terrain allowed. The forest floor in that section is relatively open. A mid-slope hardwood stand with good light penetration and limited dense understory. Animal sign is usually visible if you know what to look for. I found impressions. In a low area where seasonal seepage kept the soil soft and damp, I found clear impressions from what I assessed as a large quadruped. The morphology of the prints was consistent with a plantigrade animal, something that places the entire foot on the ground rather than the toes, which is characteristic of bears among the local fauna. The size of the individual impressions was outside the expected range for black bear, outside it significantly. The largest black bears on record in Virginia run perhaps 400 to 450 pounds. The stride length between these impressions and the depth of the prints suggested an animal substantially heavier than that, substantially larger. I photographed the prints, I measured several and noted the measurements. I wrote up the observation in my field notes under the heading, Unidentified Species Vocalization with Associated Sign. That's the clinical notation, and it's accurate as far as it goes. What it doesn't capture is that I sat beside those prints for a while after I finished photographing them, not doing anything in particular, just sitting there with the notation pad in my hand and the photographs on my phone, trying to locate the variable that would close the gap. I've played the recording for 4 colleagues, 2 of them in my department, one at a university in West Virginia who specializes in large mammal ecology, and one bioacoustics researcher who has worked extensively on sound production in large mammals. None of them have identified the species. The bioacoustics colleague found the overtone structure genuinely unusual. He used the phrase, "I've not seen that before," about the frequency distribution, which is a phrase he doesn't use casually. One of my departmental colleagues suggested I contact a researcher at another institution who has worked on rare Appalachian fauna, specifically, a researcher whose work touches on the question of whether certain large mammal species that are assumed to be locally or regionally extinct may have persisting populations in remote mountain terrain. I haven't made that contact yet. I've thought about why I haven't, and I think it's because making the contact is a different kind of commitment to the experience than just sitting with it privately. The official record says, unidentified species vocalization, associated sign, outside expected parameters for known local fauna. The unofficial record, which is this, says, whatever was out there on the second night of that November survey in the George Washington National Forest during a mast year was something that 30 years of field biology did not prepare me for, and I do not say that lightly, and I have not forgotten the sound. I want to talk about the recording at more length than I did in my initial submission, because it's the piece of the experience that has the most objective existence beyond my own memory. and because the responses I've gotten from colleagues who've heard it have been collectively more interesting than any single colleague's individual response. I have 8 minutes of the 12-minute vocalization on my phone. I recorded it on the stock voice memo application. The recording is not high fidelity. It's a phone microphone at roughly 100 meters from the source, in forest at night, and the ambient audio of the forest adds a layer of noise across the whole frequency range. The vocalization is audible. A non-expert listener can hear that something is producing sound. The quality is not sufficient for a clean spectral analysis, which is one of the limitations my bioacoustics colleague noted immediately, and which is why he can't give a definitive identification from the recording alone. He would need either a clean original recording or to hear the vocalization himself in controlled conditions. What he could tell me, working with what he had, the fundamental frequency he estimated at 80 to 100 hertz, which he noted was at the low end of what a large bear produces, but with an overtone structure that he found, and this is his word, anomalous. He said the overtone distribution didn't match the typical resonance patterns of a mammalian larynx. He said he had no specific hypothesis about what else it could be, and he didn't want to speculate. He said it would bear investigation with better recording equipment, and ideally in-person observation. The two general wildlife biologists heard what they expected to hear in slightly different ways. One of them spent 20 minutes with the recording and came away saying he couldn't identify it, but suspected it was within the range of known species, that the recording quality made it hard to be certain, and he wasn't comfortable ruling anything out. The other spent less time and was more direct. He said he didn't know what it was, and in 30 years of field work, he hadn't heard anything like it, and he wasn't going to speculate. He's the one who suggested I contact the researcher working on rare Appalachian fauna. I'll call her Dr. L without specifying further. Dr. L's work is on the edges of mainstream wildlife biology, in territory that the field views with appropriate professional caution. She's published peer-reviewed work on misidentification of rare species, on the gap between actual population data and assumed extinction, on the methodological problems with declaring a species locally extinct based on absence of detection. Her argument broadly is that the Appalachian system is large enough and inaccessible enough that species with small populations could persist without being detected for decades. That absence of evidence is not evidence of absence in a system this size and this complex. She's specifically interested in the question of what happens to species that are officially declared extinct when the declaration is based on absence of systematic survey in remote terrain rather than positive evidence of population collapse. I haven't contacted her yet. I've drafted the email twice. What stops me, and I want to be honest about this, even though it reflects something slightly uncomfortable about my professional self-image, is the following. To contact her with this material is to put my name professionally in the vicinity of her research area, which is territory my colleagues view as speculative. The recording is objective evidence. It exists, it's on my phone, multiple people have heard it. The footprints are documented in photographs. These are real data, but the interpretation of that data in the direction of Dr. L's research area would require me to make claims I can't yet defend from the available evidence. And I'm a person who does not make claims I cannot defend. What I can defend, and what I'm putting in writing here because this channel doesn't carry my professional affiliation. The vocalization I heard in the George Washington National Forest in November during a mast year at approximately 100 meters northeast of my campsite was not identifiable as any species currently documented in that forest. The sign I found the following morning was consistent with a large quadruped of greater mass than any species currently documented in that forest. These are the facts. They're on my phone. They're in my field notes. They're in my head. Every time I open the voice memo application on my phone, I scroll past the recording, It's 11 minutes and 43 seconds long, and it's titled with the date and GPS coordinates, the way I title all my field recordings. I've never deleted it. I don't think I'm gonna. The sound on those nights when something wakes me at 2 or 3 in the morning, which it happens to everyone who has spent years sleeping in the woods, is the first thing I reach for. Not the memory of the tracks or the tree marks or my colleagues' responses to the recording. The sound itself, which lives in the body the way certain sounds do. The way the sounds of your early childhood live there, resident without invitation, available without effort. The low, pulsed rhythm of it. The harmonic depth that spoke to size and mass, and presence in a way that I was professionally trained to assess, and that, in this case, assess to something I don't have a name for. I'll contact Dr. L eventually. I'll share the recording and the field notes and the photographs. I'll write it up properly. There's a way to do it that's scientifically defensible and careful, and that doesn't make claims beyond the evidence. And that's the way I'll do it. When I'm ready. When I've worked out exactly how to say, I've been in the field for 30 years. I know these mountains. I know these animals. And what I heard that night was something that none of that knowledge prepared me for. Quick pause here. If you've had something happen to you in these mountains, or anywhere remote, it doesn't have to be Appalachia. Send it in. The link is in the description. We read everything that comes in, every single submission. Some of the best ones we've ever gotten came from people who almost didn't send it because they thought no one would believe them, or because they felt like it was too small, too hard to describe, too strange to put into words. Send it anyway. The act of writing it down matters, and this is a place where it will be read without judgment. Story 9. MIA. We decided to write this together because we were together when it happened, and we want the record to be from both of us, not just one account filtered through one memory. We've told this story separately to people who know us, and every time we do, we compare notes afterward, and the details always match. That's the part people find hardest to believe for some reason. They expect that if two people are both remembering something strange, the memories will drift apart over time, that one of us will add a detail the other doesn't have, or vice versa, but ours haven't. The story is the same story every time. John. I'll start with the context. Mia and I have been hiking together for about 12 years. We met at a trail work event in our early 20s and have been going out together ever since, with occasional solo trips, but mostly as a team. We have a comfortable system. We navigate well together, we communicate well, and we have a similar enough pace that we rarely end up in the frustrating dynamic, where one person is always waiting for the other. We're not elite athletes, and we don't claim to be, but we're experienced and capable hikers, and we've done enough miles together that the mechanics of it are entirely automatic. MIA. The trail in question is a loop in the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. We've done it 3 times now, including the trip when this happened. The first time we did it was when we moved to Christiansburg, as a way of getting to know the terrain around our new home. We liked it enough to go back the following fall. And then we went a 3rd time, which is the trip I'm writing about. John, we knew that trail. That's what I want to emphasize. Not just, we'd done it twice before, familiar, but the kind of familiar where you're anticipating the next section before you get to it, where the route lives in your body rather than just your memory. The view at the clearing on the second ridge, the boggy section near the headwaters where you have to pick your way across, the long descent with the exposure on the right side. We knew it. MIA, the trip was a 2-day. We camped the first night in our preferred spot and broke camp the second morning and set out for the return leg, which would bring us back to the trailhead in a few hours. Good morning, good conditions. We were talking most of the way, which is normal for us on the return leg when the pressure of making miles is off and we can just be in the walk. John, maybe 2 miles from the trailhead, maybe 2 hours from the car. We've been on the return leg long enough that we were in the familiar section, the last stretch that you know in detail because you've come through it at the end every time. when everything looks a certain way because it's almost over and you're tired and the car is nearby. We came around a bend that I knew of, a left-hand curve where the trail goes through a gap in a rock outcrop. And we were looking at a section of trail we'd already walked that morning. MIA. There's a rock formation about 30 yards past the gap in the outcrop. A specific one. I'd photographed it on our first trip through that morning because I liked the way the lichen grew on it. This great layered pattern of different lichen species, orange, gray, and green. And I'd taken the photo and moved on. We came around that bend in the afternoon and the rock formation was right there in front of us. John, we had been walking in one direction. We had not turned around. We had not backtracked. The trail doesn't loop back on itself at that section. There's no switchback, no spur trail, no route that would explain approaching that rock formation from the direction we approached it. We came at it from the direction that, based on our position and the direction we'd been walking, should have been our destination. We came at it from ahead of ourselves. MIA. I pulled out my phone and went to the camera roll because I wanted to see the timestamp on the photo I'd taken. The photo was from 8:14 in the morning. It was mid-afternoon. We had left that spot 7 hours earlier, walking in the direction we'd walked all day, and we were somehow standing in front of it again. John, I had the map out in about 30 seconds. Paper topo that I keep in my hip belt pocket on any trip where navigation could matter. I oriented it. I found our location. I looked at the trail from our morning position to our current position, and there was nothing on the map that explained how we could have arrived at the morning position from the afternoon direction. No loop within the loop, no connecting trail, no feature of the terrain that would have folded us back on ourselves without us retracing our steps. MIA. We sat down. We ate a snack because that's what you do when you need to think, and hiking has trained you to associate sitting down with eating. We talked it through. We went back through the morning and tried to identify a point at which we might have made an error, taken a wrong fork, missed a junction. We'd been talking the whole time. We'd been paying attention. Neither of us had flagged anything unusual. John, we didn't come up with anything, so we started walking. We went through the section we'd already done that morning, and it was exactly as we remembered it. The same features in the same order, the same terrain. The trailhead came up when it should have, and we were done. MIA. We've talked to other hikers about it since. Not broadcasting the story, just mentioning it when the subject comes up and paying attention to how people respond. Two people, independently, without knowing each other or knowing our story, have described experiences in that same trail system, where the trail seemed to fold back on itself. One of them described it as the trail repeating, which is the phrase that keeps coming back to me because it's almost exactly what it felt like. The trail repeated. We had been in a section we'd already been in, and we'd arrived at it wrong. John, I've thought about the physics of it, or the anti-physics of it, and the thing I keep coming back to is that I don't have a framework. I have a strong preference for rational explanations, and I've been unable to produce one that accounts for all the facts simultaneously. I can account for most of them with most explanations. I can't account for all of them with any explanation. MIA. The photograph helps. The timestamp on the photograph is a data point that exists outside my memory, outside John's memory, outside the conversation we've had about it since. 8:14 in the morning, and we were standing in front of that rock at mid-afternoon, having approached it from the wrong direction after a full day of walking the other way. That's in the camera roll. That part isn't a question. John. We went back the following fall. We did the same loop. The trail was exactly as it should have been. The rock formation with the lichen was exactly where it is on the map. Exactly where it had been both times we'd passed it the previous year. First at 8:14 in the morning, and then, inexplicably, from the wrong direction in the afternoon. We took a picture of it again. Timestamp 9:47 a.m. MIA. I wish we'd thought to photograph something on the day it happened. Not the rock. We had that photo. Something that would have captured the direction we'd come from, the position we were in. But you don't think about documentation in the moment. In the moment, you think, what just happened? And then you eat a snack and you start walking. John, there's a thing that Mia said to me on the drive home that I want to add, because I think it's the most honest thing either of us has said about the experience, and it didn't make it into the original submission. She was quiet for most of the drive home. We were about 40 minutes out when she said, "What bothers me most is not knowing how long it took." I asked her what she meant. She said, "We were on the trail for 2 hours before we found the rock formation again. 2 hours of walking in one direction and ending up somewhere we'd already been. But we don't know what happened in those 2 hours. We were walking, we were talking, we were present in what felt like ordinary experience. But we ended up in a place we shouldn't have been able to reach. And we don't know how. And we don't know what was in the gap between where we should have been and where we were." I thought about that for the rest of the drive, and I've thought about it many times since. The timestamp on the photograph establishes that we were at that rock formation at 8:14 in the morning. The timestamp on the second photograph, the one I took when we found the rock formation again in the afternoon, was 2:37, 6 hours and 23 minutes. We walked for 6.5 hours and ended up back where we'd started the morning's walk, having approached from the wrong direction. 6 hours and 23 minutes of a day we can fully account for in memory, but cannot account for in space. The day makes sense from the inside. From the outside, from the map's perspective, it doesn't. MIA. I've read about people who have had experiences that sound something like this one, in other mountain ranges and other contexts. The accounts use different language and come from different frameworks of understanding. Some of them talk about what they call the fold, which is a colloquial term that various communities have developed for this apparent phenomenon without any central coordination. Some of them talk about it in terms of time rather than space, which is a slightly different flavor of the same basic experience. The trail repeated. The time repeated. You were somewhere you'd already been. What I find most interesting about the accounts I've read is how often the experience involves a route that the person knew well, not a first-time hiker navigating unfamiliar terrain and getting disoriented. Someone who knew the trail, who had been on it before, who was not confused about the route. That detail keeps appearing. The familiarity of the route is described as part of what made it so strange. Not, I was confused and ended up somewhere I hadn't been before, but I was not confused and ended up somewhere I had already been. The return trail, not a wrong trail. The repetition, not the deviation. John, we've talked about going back enough times that we've worked out a protocol of sorts. If that's not too strong a word for two people deciding in advance how they'd handle a weird situation. We'd bring paper maps and mark the time each time we passed a major landmark. We'd stay closer together than we normally do. We'd photograph everything that looks distinctive with timestamps, so there's a continuous record of what we passed and when. We'd be scientists about it, or as close as two non-scientists can get to being scientists about a hiking trip. We haven't done it yet. I think we're waiting without fully admitting we're waiting for enough distance to have accumulated between us and the original experience that it feels like research rather than return. Waiting to feel like we're going back because we want to understand something rather than because we haven't fully finished understanding something. The difference between those two things is subtle and also complete. MIA. What the photograph with the timestamp gives me on difficult days with this experience is a specific kind of stability. It happened. It's documented. The timestamp doesn't lie. And 8:14 in the morning, and I was there, and then hours later I was there again from the wrong direction, and the photograph was evidence of where I'd been. The experience is strange, but it's grounded in an artifact, a real photograph taken with a real phone on a real morning in the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. The world is real. What happened in it was strange. Both things. That's what I keep coming back to. Both things. The world is real and what happened in it was strange. And those two facts don't actually contradict each other. They just make the world larger than I thought it was. Larger in a direction I didn't know existed. That's uncomfortable. I think it's supposed to be. Story 10, turkey season. I want to put that up front because context matters for how this story gets read. I was in the woods legally, I was in equipment I know, and I was doing something I've been doing for the better part of 30 years. I'm not someone who spooks easy out there. I've been hunting Appalachian forests since I was old enough to hold a gun, and I've been going out alone since my early 20s. I know the difference between ordinary wood sounds and unusual ones. I know what a spooked deer sounds like versus a bear moving at the edge of timber. I know what healthy animal sign looks like versus sign that raises questions. I'm a careful observer by habit and by necessity, because hunting rewards careful observation. The Cumberland Plateau is where I do most of my hunting. It's a specific kind of Appalachian terrain. A long, elevated tableland that runs through Middle Tennessee and Kentucky, with sharp escarpments on the east and west sides, where the plateau drops to the valley floor, and a dense interior of second and third growth timber interspersed with old clearings and drainages that hold turkey and deer in good numbers if you know where to look. I've hunted it for 15 years. I have spots I return to every season, spots I've scouted carefully and know well. And I have a sense of the plateau's rhythms that took years to develop and that I trust. The blind I was hunting out of that morning was in a site I'd been using for 2 seasons. Small natural clearing, good sight lines, some turkey activity in the area based on my preseason scouting. I'd been in the blind before the light came up. 4 in the morning with a headlamp and a thermos of coffee, set up and waiting as the woods came light around me. That process, from dark to dawn in a good hunting spot, is one of my favorite things. The gradual addition of detail as the light increases, the sound of the world waking up, the specific quality of cold air on a spring morning before the sun has any heat in it. I've done it hundreds of times and I never get tired of it. The morning produced some turkey activity. I could hear birds in the distance, gobbling on the roost before flydown, which I could estimate at about 300 yards to my southeast. Nothing came to the clearing. By 9 o'clock, I was satisfied that the spot was not going to produce anything that morning. I decided to move, to walk a short loop around my position, and try to get a sense of where the birds had gone after flydown, and whether I should reposition for the afternoon hunt. I was maybe a half mile from the blind, following a drainage bottom that I knew from previous scouting, when I saw the disturbance in the ground ahead of me and stopped. My first read on it was a natural salt lick. There are salt licks throughout the plateau. Minerals seeping from the substrate attract deer and other animals, and the repeated use of these spots creates a distinctive pattern of churned, disturbed earth that you can identify from a distance once you've seen a few of them. Hunters find them useful for patterning wildlife movement. I've found natural ones before. I know what they look like. This one was wrong from the start. The first thing that registered was the size of the area of disturbed, churned ground was at least 12 feet across, possibly larger. The natural salt licks I've encountered in 30 years of hunting have been 2 to 4 feet across at most, occasionally as much as 6 if the site has been used heavily over a long period. 12 feet is outside any range I've seen. It's outside any range I've heard of, speaking with other hunters over the years. Something had been using this site with a frequency and intensity far beyond what any animal I was familiar with would produce. I moved closer. The ground at the center of the lick was deeply churned, not just surface disturbance, but torn up several inches deep. Dark, wet soil exposed, the ground compressed, and worked the way high-use wildlife areas get. And surrounding it in the soft earth at the margins of the disturbance, there were tracks. I've identified animal tracks my entire adult life. It's a skill that takes years to develop properly, to the point where you can read substrate condition and rain exposure and sun exposure and walking speed from the distortion of the print, where you can distinguish between a running bear print and a walking one, between a buck's track and a doe's. I know deer tracks and bear tracks and wild hog tracks and turkey tracks and every smaller animal. I know what a big track looks like, and I know what a track looks like when the animal that made it is heavy. The tracks around this lick were not any animal I knew. I can say that clearly, and I want to be clear about why I'm saying it, rather than just saying I didn't recognize them, because those are different claims. I didn't recognize them not because they were degraded or unclear, but because they were clear, and they did not match anything in my knowledge base. Four-toed, where I could read the count clearly, which was not every print, because some were partially obscured, but enough to establish the count. The pad structure was wrong for bear, which is the large animal track I'm most familiar with. The depth of impression in soil that had been wet recently and was now on the drier side spoke to significant weight. The stride length between clear sequential prints was longer than any bear stride I've measured. I stood at the edge of that clearing for a long time. I photographed the tracks from multiple angles. I photographed the overall lick area. I walked the perimeter of the disturbance slowly and counted prints, and tried to build a picture of the movement pattern, the way the animal or animals had moved around and through the site. The pattern was consistent with a single large animal returning to the same spot repeatedly, not a herd of deer or a group of hogs working an area, but a single large animal with a routine. Then I looked up and I saw the tree. There's a mature red oak at the edge of the clearing, probably 100 years old, with a trunk diameter of maybe 18 inches. The bark on the side facing the clearing had been stripped from roughly waist height up to approximately 8 feet off the ground. Not stripped the way deer strip it when they're rubbing velvet off antlers. That's a specific horizontal scarring pattern that I know well. Not stripped the way bears mark trees, which is also a specific pattern. A more vertical scarring with claw marks at the top and bite marks along the upper edge, at heights that correspond to the bear's reach. This was different. The bark had been removed in large section, not scraped, removed, and the exposed wood underneath had been gouged. Deep, parallel marks running vertically up the trunk, some of them several inches wide. The mark spread was too wide for any claw I knew. The height of the upper marks was 8 feet. I took photographs of all of it and then I left. Not running, not in a panic. I simply decided clearly and without drama that I was done in that area for the day, and I walked back toward my blind and then out to my truck and I drove home. When I got home, I pulled up everything I could find on unusual animal sign in the Cumberland Plateau region. I looked through hunting forums, wildlife management publications, academic literature on Appalachian fauna. I found nothing that matched what I'd seen. The tracks were outside the parameters for any species documented in the region. The tree marking was outside the parameters for any behavior pattern I could find described. I sent the photographs to 2 hunting friends who have significantly more experience than I do without telling them where I'd taken them or what I thought I was looking at. Both of them had the same response, essentially. They didn't know what made those marks, and they'd never seen anything like them. I've been back to the plateau many times since. I've hunted that area twice more. I've gone specifically to the clearing where the lick was, to check on it. The lick is still there, still disturbed. The ground still churned in the same way. The tree is still marked. I haven't found fresh tracks on either of my subsequent visits, which might mean the animal has moved on, or might mean I was there at the wrong time. I don't know. I'm not going to put a name to what I think made those tracks. I'll leave it where the evidence leaves it. Something large, something heavy, something with a stride and a print morphology outside the range of anything documented to live on the Cumberland Plateau, using a salt lick 12 feet across and marking a tree at 8 feet. If someone can tell me what animal that is, I'd genuinely like to know. The photographs are still on my phone. I've never deleted them. I've shown them to maybe 8 people over 2 years and gotten 8 different responses, which I think tells you less about the photographs and more about the frameworks people bring to what they see. The 2 hunting friends I mentioned, the ones who said they'd never seen anything like it, asked me separately whether I'd considered the possibility of a bear that was unusually large. I had considered it. The problem is that unusually large is doing a lot of work in that explanation. The largest black bear on record in Tennessee, as far as I've been able to determine, came in around 500 pounds. The impressions I found suggest an animal that was considerably beyond that range. How much beyond? I can't say precisely. Print depth is influenced by soil conditions, gait, and load distribution in ways that make precise mass estimation from prints alone unreliable. But the depth of impression in the soil of known condition, combined with the stride length, are both outside the range I'd expect from even a very large black bear. Not marginally outside, substantially. A wildlife biologist friend of a friend looked at the photographs and was quiet for a while, and then said he didn't know what to make of the tree marking. He found the prints easier to dismiss. Unusual, but within the range of biological variability, which is a sentence that sounds definitive until you realize it's not saying anything specific. The tree marking he found harder. He noted the height of the upper marks, the width of the gouges, and the pattern of the bark removal, and said he couldn't identify a behavior pattern that matched it. Not from any species he'd studied. He said he'd be very interested to have been at the site in person, which is the kind of thing scientists say when they're interested, but also aware of the professional costs of being too interested. I've been back to the clearing 3 times. The lick is still active. The ground is still churned and damp, and the pattern I first found suggesting continued regular use. The tree still has the markings. The upper edge of the strip section has dried and begun to callus over the way damaged bark does. The tree is alive. Whatever marked it didn't kill it. I found tracks on one of the 3 visits. Newer ones, sharper, showing less weathering exposure than the ones I originally found. The same morphology, the same stride length. Whatever is using that lick is still using it. I haven't set up a camera trap there. I've thought about it many times. I know how to do it, and I have the equipment. The reasons I haven't are worth being honest about. Part of it is practical. A camera trap that gets destroyed or stolen is a loss I'd rather avoid, and I don't know what happens to camera equipment in the vicinity of whatever is using that lick. Part of it is something else that I find harder to articulate. Something close to the instinct that made me leave when I found the clearing in the first place. Some quality of that site that makes me feel when I'm there that I have been extended a kind of tolerance. I can be present and observe and document and leave. And that pushing beyond the terms of that tolerance would be a mistake. I'm aware that that sounds irrational. A hunter with 30 years of field experience being deterred by a feeling from deploying a standard piece of wildlife monitoring equipment. I know how it sounds. I'm putting it in the record anyway, because it's the truth of what I've experienced every time I've considered setting up the camera, and the truth is what I'm trying to record here. The plateau is what it is. The clearing is what it is. Whatever is using it has been using it long enough that the lick is 12 feet across, and the tree is marked at 8 feet. I've been hunting the area for 15 years and never found that lick before that morning, never found sign like that before that morning, never came home from a morning in the woods with the feeling I came home with that day, that I had looked at something that didn't want to be looked at, had read its sign, had stood at the edge of its space, and had been, for reasons having nothing to do with any capability I possess, allowed to leave. Story 11. My husband and I have been paddling together for about 8 years. We started with canoes, moved to kayaks when we realized we liked the independence of solo boats, and have been doing flat water trips on lakes and reservoirs throughout the Tennessee and North Carolina mountains for long enough that we have genuine preferences. We prefer cold weather to hot because the bugs are gone and the boat traffic is minimal. We prefer weekdays to weekends for the same reason. And we prefer Calderwood Lake to almost anywhere else because it is, by any standard, one of the more beautiful and difficult to access reservoirs in the entire southern Appalachian system, which means that on a cold weekday in October, you can have miles of water entirely to yourself. Calderwood is a TVA reservoir on the Little Tennessee River in the section of the Cherokee country that most people drive through rather than paddle into. The access is limited and requires some planning. The put-in is a rough boat ramp, and the lake itself is long and narrow, shaped by the river valley it flooded, with high ridges on both sides and numerous coves and inlets cut into the shoreline. The water is cold and clear, the kind of clear where you can see the bottom in 10 feet of water, and the color shifts from turquoise to deep green as it deepens. On a still morning with fog in the ridges above it, Calderwood is about as close to perfect as a paddling destination gets. The morning we're writing about was a Wednesday in mid-October. We'd put in early before the light was fully on the water and paddled south along the east shore for about 1.5 miles before cutting across to a cove on the south shore that we'd identified on previous trips as a good spot for a rest and lunch. The cove was sheltered from any wind that moved down the main channel, and the water inside it was glassy and still. The kind of still that shows you the ridgeline above perfectly inverted in the surface. We pulled in and rafted up the 2 kayaks and broke out our food and did the kind of nothing that is the whole point of a cold weekday on a beautiful lake. We'd been in the cove maybe 20 minutes when the other kayaker came around the point. They appeared from behind the rocky point at the far end of the cove, a paddler in a solo kayak, moving at a casual pace. At 200 yards in open water, you can see a lot, whether someone is in a sit-on-top or a touring boat, the color of the hull, whether they're paddling efficiently. What I saw was a dark-hulled sit-on-top, somewhat older-looking, moving at a pace that suggested easy paddling. I raised a hand in the standard greeting. My husband did the same. The paddler did not wave back. That happens. Some people are on the water specifically because they don't want interaction, and a non-returned wave is a clear enough signal. We went back to eating. I kept them in my peripheral vision the way you keep another boat in your awareness when you're on the water together, not staring, just maintaining situational awareness. The paddler came into the center of the cove and stopped, pulled their paddle across the deck, the way you do when you're resting. The kayak began the very slow rotation that an unpowered boat does in still water when there's no current and no wind, not spinning, just a glacially slow drift of the bow one way or another as the water makes minute adjustments. That's normal and unremarkable. What was less normal was that the paddler had not moved since shipping the paddle. At rest, people move. You shift your weight. You reach for a water bottle. You turn your head to look at something. You adjust a hat. My husband said quietly that the person wasn't paddling, which was true, but what he was really saying was that the person wasn't doing anything. They were sitting in a boat that was slowly rotating in still water, and they were as still as the kayak's hull. I called across the water. Sound carries well on a flat, enclosed body of water. 200 yards is nothing. You could have a conversation at that distance if both parties were willing. "Hey, you doing okay over there?" Silence. My husband called louder. "Hey, everything all right?" Nothing. The kayak continued its slow rotation, and the figure on it did not respond. We started paddling toward them, slowly, easily. Not an urgent charge, just moving in their direction to close the distance and get a better look and make sure everything was actually fine. As we got closer, I watched the figure carefully for the natural response that a person makes when 2 kayaks are obviously paddling toward them. A turn of the head, a pickup of the paddle, some acknowledgement of the approach. Nothing came. At 100 yards, I could see more, but not much. The hull was dark green, old enough that the color was faded to something closer to gray-green. The person on it was wearing dark clothing, what might have been a jacket or a vest, nothing reflective. They were facing roughly away from us, which was consistent with the kayak's slow rotation, having turned them in that direction, but they had not reoriented as we approached. A paddler who sees two kayaks coming toward them orients toward the approaching boats. It's a water habit, an automatic behavior. This person had not done it. At 50 yards, my husband pointed out the waterline. I'd been noticing it without fully registering it. The way you notice something wrong before you can name what's wrong. The kayak was sitting low. Not catastrophically low, not swamped, but lower than a sit-on-top kayak with a single adult paddler should sit. A sit-on-top kayak, by design, has a predictable freeboard. The distance between the waterline and the top of the hull, that freeboard is determined by the weight it's carrying. A single adult paddler, no significant gear, should produce a specific freeboard that any experienced paddler knows by sight. This kayak was sitting as if it was carrying more than that, significantly more. We stopped paddling. 50 yards out, both of us sitting still in our boats, looking at the other kayak. The figure on it had not moved. The kayak was sitting low. The cove was completely quiet. The kayak began to turn, not through a paddle stroke. Neither of the figure's hands moved, and there was no paddle in the water, not through an obvious shift of weight. The kayak simply rotated, as if the water itself had reached up and turned it steadily and without turbulence, until the bow was pointing at us. Until the person on it, whoever or whatever had been facing away, was now facing toward us. There was no one on it. I want to be very clear about the sequence of events here, because I've replayed it many times and the sequence is what I'm certain of. The kayak was rotating toward us. We could see the front of it coming around, and as the bow cleared the midpoint of the rotation, as the front of the hull and the portion of the deck where a paddler sits came into view, there was nothing there. The kayak was empty. The deck where a person had been sitting was unoccupied. The weight we'd been seeing in the waterline, the weight that had been pressing the hull lower than an empty boat should sit, was gone. We did not say anything. We paddled back toward the put-in at a pace that we did not acknowledge or discuss. We paddled with our heads forward, and we did not look back at the cove, and we did not speak until we were around the far point, and the cove was out of sight behind us. Then my husband said, "Let's go." And we paddled the 1.5 miles back at a pace we wouldn't normally sustain on a casual morning. We loaded the boats on the car and drove home. We've been back to Calderwood twice since. Different sections of the lake, different coves. The water has been the water both times, cold and clear and beautiful, with nothing unusual on it. I don't think about the kayak constantly anymore, but I think about the waterline, the way it sat too low for an empty boat, which means it was sitting at the right level for something on it. And then the something was gone, and the level was still wrong for a moment, before the boat rose back to where an empty boat sits. That detail is the one I can't talk myself out of. An empty boat rises. There was a moment when it should have risen and it hadn't yet. And then it did. Story 12. I want to start with the geography because I think it matters for understanding how wrong this was. The fire road I'm talking about is in the Nantahala National Forest, which spans a large section of far western North Carolina. Fire roads in that part of the Nantahala are not the kind of roads that see significant recreational traffic. They're maintained minimally, graded infrequently, and intended primarily for Forest Service access during fire events and for occasional timber operations. The one I use is a single-lane road that climbs and drops through remote terrain for about 11 miles before it dead ends at a turnaround near a creek that I fish. There is no campsite at the end. There is no trailhead. There is no amenity of any kind. There is a turnaround and there is a creek, and that's the attraction because the creek is excellent and gets very little pressure from anglers because the road is too long and too rough for most people to bother with. I've been driving that road twice a year for 8 years. 16 trips before and after the incident I'm describing. Not one of those trips before or after have I seen another person on the road. Not at the beginning, not at the end, not at any point along the 11 miles. The road is functionally unknown to the recreational public. The Forest Service might drive it once or twice a year. Otherwise, it's empty. The morning I'm writing about was 2 years ago, late April. I'd had a good morning on the creek. Decent water temperature, some activity in the pocket water behind the larger boulders. The kind of morning that earns the long drive in. I was headed back out on the road mid-morning, moving at the pace that road demands, which is slow, maybe 15 miles an hour on the good stretches and significantly less on the rough ones. The road had dried well from the previous week's rain, and I was making decent time. It was clear and bright, well past the hour when ground fog had burned off, midday light flat and direct. There was nothing soft or ambiguous about the visibility. I came around a long left-hand bend where the road straightens out for about a quarter mile with a ridgeline visible above the right side, and there was a girl standing at the edge of the road about 200 yards ahead. Everything I'm about to describe, I registered in the first 30 seconds of seeing her. My brain ran through the inventory, the way a mind does when something doesn't fit its context. The distance to the nearest road junction from which a person might have walked in, which was miles. The absence of any vehicle, the absence of any gear, no pack, no water bottle visible at her side, nothing indicating a person who had prepared to be in this place. She appeared to be between 10 and 12 years old. She was wearing a dress. A light-colored dress, not the bright synthetic colors of children's outdoor clothing, but a plain light color, something between white and cream. The dress was not appropriate to the environment in any way. Not in terms of warmth, not in terms of protection from brush and terrain, not in terms of anything that would make sense for a person planning to be on this road. I slowed to a stop alongside her and rolled down the window. She looked at me without alarm. This was one of the things that registered immediately, and that I've thought about at length since. She looked at me without any of the wariness that a child who has found themselves in an isolated situation should produce. No distress, no relief, no caution. Just a level, calm regard. The kind of look that belongs on a face much older than hers. I asked her if she was okay. She said yes. I asked if she was alone. She said yes. I asked where her parents were. She said home. I told her she was a long way from anywhere, 11 miles from the nearest paved road, and asked if she needed a ride. She said no. She was waiting for someone. I asked who. She told me her first name. I've chosen not to include it in this submission, and I want to explain why. I've tried a few times to research the name in the context of that area. Old property records, old family names from that part of the county, and what I found made me uncomfortable enough that I don't want to put the name into wider circulation until I understand more about what I found. That's probably going to be the most unsatisfying sentence in this submission, and I'm sorry for that. I just have a reason. I sat in the truck with the engine running and thought about what to do. I've turned it over many times since, and I believe I made the right call, but I can see the ways in which it could have been the wrong one. She didn't appear to be in distress. She wasn't asking for help. She was calm. She'd given me a direct and apparently confident answer about where she was and what she was doing. If I'd been dealing with an adult in the same situation, I would have accepted those answers and driven on. But this was a child alone on a remote Forest Service road, 11 miles from the main road, in clothing that made no sense for the environment, waiting for someone who was obviously not there. I told her I was going to stay with her until whoever she was waiting for arrived. She told me that wouldn't be necessary. Then she turned and walked into the tree line. Not along the road, which is what a person does when they want to create distance on a narrow road. They step to the edge and give the vehicle room. She walked into the trees, perpendicular to the road. through the brush at the road edge, which was not thick but was not nothing. The kind of scrub growth that lines the edges of a maintained forest road, a few feet of mixed undergrowth before the canopy takes over. She moved through it the way a deer moves through it, smoothly, without hesitation, without the noise and awkwardness that a human body in a dress makes when it's pushing through vegetation. She was gone in a few seconds. Not dramatically gone, not swallowed by some dramatic darkness. Just gone, the way you're gone when the forest takes you. I sat in the truck for a while, I don't know how long. Then I drove to the main Forest Service Road junction and continued toward the highway and called 911 from the first point I got cell service. I gave the location as precisely as I could. The stretch of road, the approximate milepost marker, the direction I'd been driving. I gave a description. The dispatcher took the information and said they'd send someone to check. No one ever called me back with a follow-up. I didn't follow up myself, which is something I've thought about a lot, whether I should have pressed for information on what they found or didn't find. But I didn't, partly because I wasn't sure how to explain over the phone why I was asking, and partly because, on some level, I think I was afraid of both possible answers, that they'd found something, or that they'd found nothing. I've driven that road 4 times since. I go in the afternoon now, not the morning. I don't have a fully articulated reason for that preference, but there it is. Something about the quality of morning light on that road feels different to me now. I've never seen her again. I've never seen anyone else on that road. The road is as empty as it always was, as remote as it always was, with the creek at the end that is still excellent and gets very little pressure. The thing I come back to most is not the strangeness of the encounter itself, though the strangeness was significant. It's the way she looked at me when I pulled up. Children in strange situations have a specific kind of look, either fearful or deliberately performing calm in an unconvincing way, either wanting help or fighting the need for it. This was neither, it was something else. A look that came from a different relationship to the situation than the one I was trying to map onto it, like she knew something about where she was and what she was doing that I didn't, and was mildly curious about me in the way you're mildly curious about something that passes through your space without fully understanding it. I don't know what I saw. I know what I reported to 911. I know what she said to me and what I said to her. I know she walked into the trees and I couldn't follow where she went. I know there are records somewhere that I've looked at and then set back down. And I know I'd drive that road differently now. Afternoons only. Going in and coming out while there was still plenty of light left. Not because I think that makes a meaningful difference, just because it feels like the thing to do. The name she gave me. I said in the original submission that I'd chosen not to include it, and that I'd done some research that made me uncomfortable. I want to explain that slightly more, without being more specific than I think is wise. The name was a first name, not a last name, an old name. Old-fashioned in the way that certain names in Appalachian communities remain in use long after they've fallen out of favor in the broader culture, the way names pass down through families, and stay local long after they've gone global. The kind of name that indexes a specific community and a specific history rather than a general cultural moment. When I got home from that trip, I did what I do when something is bothering me and I have access to resources. I researched it. I pulled up the historical records available for that part of the county census records, county deed records available through the state archives, church records that have been digitized and made available through genealogical societies. I was not looking for anything specific. I was looking for what was there. There were multiple instances of the name in the historical record for that area. That's not surprising. An old-fashioned name in an Appalachian county with a continuous family history is going to appear multiple times in the records. I was not expecting to find one specific instance that corresponded to anything I'd experienced. I was not expecting anything. I was just looking. I found an entry in a church record from the 1940s. I'm not going to say which church or which year, and I'm aware that this level of vagueness is frustrating in a submission that asks for specific details. But the entry was specific enough in its details that I was uncomfortable, and I've been uncomfortable about it since. And I've decided that my discomfort is sufficient reason not to include it. The entry concerned a child of approximately the right age range. The details of the entry were not what a typical church record entry contains. I'll say one more thing about it and then I'll leave it alone. The location referenced in the entry, vaguely in the kind of shorthand that an entry of that type would use, was consistent with the general area where the fire road runs. Not the fire road specifically, because the fire road didn't exist in the 1940s in the form it exists now, but the drainage, the general geography, consistent with it. I don't know what I found. I'm not making a claim about what the entry means in relation to what I saw. I'm a person with a professional habit of finding and reading historical records. But what I found when I went looking made me close the browser and not go back to it for several weeks. That's the extent of what I'm prepared to say. The way she walked into the trees, I think about that the most. Not the calm regard, not the name, not the dress. In April on a remote fire road 11 miles from pavement, the way she walked into the trees, smoothly without the noise that a human body in a dress makes when it pushes through brush. Because it was unlike any movement I've seen a person make. It was the movement of something that knew the woods the way the woods know themselves. The movement of something that was home. I hope she's home. Whatever she was, wherever she is, in whatever sense those words apply to her. I hope she's home. Story 13. I'm a local historian. My specific focus is Appalachian, Kentucky. The social and material history of the communities in the eastern part of the state, from the period of initial European settlement through the early 20th century. I've spent the better part of 20 years in county archives and private collections, in the back rooms of courthouses, and in the field. The field part is important. A historian of this region who doesn't go to the places they're studying is missing something irreplaceable. The landscape is a primary document. The hollows and the ridgelines and the creek bottoms are part of the archive, and you learn things from them that you can't learn from any paper record. I say all of this not to establish credentials, but to establish disposition. I am professionally skeptical. I know how oral accounts work, how they accumulate meaning, how they edit themselves in the telling, how a dramatic experience becomes more dramatic in the retelling, not because the teller is dishonest, but because memory is not a recording, it's a reconstruction, and reconstructions respond to what the reconstructor needs them to mean. I know how the human mind makes stories out of experience, and how those stories change over time, and how to evaluate them accordingly. I know about the fallibility of perception, about priming effects in eyewitness accounts, about the ways that expectation shapes what we perceive. All of this is central to my professional practice. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that when I tell you I cannot explain what happened at Whittleton Branch, I'm saying it after running the experience through every critical filter available to me, and it still doesn't resolve. Whittleton Branch is a trail in the Red River Gorge geological area in Powell County, Kentucky. The Red River Gorge is one of the genuinely significant natural areas in the eastern United States. A deeply eroded sandstone landscape with natural arches, towering cliffs, and a river drainage that has been carved into the Cumberland Plateau over millions of years. It's well known to hikers and climbers, particularly the main circuit trails and the areas around the more dramatic geological features. The Whittleton Branch Trail is a quieter part of the system, running along a tributary creek through a narrow hollow that shows evidence of historical land use extending back to the early settlement period. That historical land use is what brought me there. I had found a reference in a county records archive, a 1927 land survey document to a structure on the Whittleton Branch drainage. The surveyor had noted it in passing, the kind of notational aside that surveyors sometimes included about existing improvements. And the notation was specific enough to give me a rough location. The structure itself was listed as a cabin or dwelling extant. That was 1927. I had no way of knowing if anything remained by the time I was there, and I expected nothing. 100 years is a long time for a structure in that environment to persist without maintenance, and anything below the cliffline in the gorge is subject to rockfall and flooding on a geological timeline that is essentially continuous. I went out on a Wednesday in early March, alone. I usually work alone in the field, partly because it's easier to move at my own pace, and partly because the kind of attention a historical site requires is difficult to maintain in the presence of someone who doesn't share the professional interest. The trail was quiet. Midweek in early March in the gorge is not a high traffic time, and I had the Whittleton Branch section to myself. I found the location from the survey document's notation without too much difficulty. The survey had been thorough enough to tie the location to a creek confluence that still exists. And from that anchor point, the rough distance and bearing led me to a specific spot on the south side of the drainage. The hollow there is narrow, maybe 30 feet across at its widest, with sandstone walls rising on both sides above the tree line and the creek running along the bottom. Old growth timber at the upper end, the kind of big tulip poplars and hemlocks that indicate ground undisturbed for a very long time. There was, as I expected, no structure, but there were depressions in the terrain. Subtle, but once you're looking for them, you can read them. A rectangular pattern of lowered ground that once held foundation stones, now dispersed by root action and frost heave, with fragments of what might have been chinking material at the corners. A suggestion of cleared ground in the vegetation pattern above it, where pioneer species like elderberry and multiflora rose had established themselves in the space that had once been kept open. If you knew what you were looking for, you could read the ghost of the structure in the landscape. I was photographing the depression pattern from various angles, making notes, measuring distances from the creek, when I heard the singing. It was not humming. I want to be precise about this distinction because it matters for how the experience should be understood. Humming is indeterminate, ambient, easy to dismiss or misidentify. What I heard was singing. Specifically, it was singing with words in a female voice at a distance I estimated as between 60 and 80 feet, coming from further along the hollow in the direction it bent out of my sight to the northeast. The words were not distinct to me at that distance. I couldn't make out the specific text of what was being sung, but the syllabic structure of the singing was clear. The way the rising and falling of the melody corresponded to speech rhythms, the way the phrasing moved in lines. And the structure of the song itself was familiar to me in a professional sense. I've spent years with traditional Appalachian music. It's adjacent to my historical research because the music carries history the way a written document does. And understanding the musical tradition is part of understanding the community. I know what old Appalachian ballads sound like, the unaccompanied single voice, the specific modal melodic structures that predate the major-minor system of European classical music, the way the melody ornaments at the ends of phrases, the long-held tones at cadences. What I was hearing matched all of those characteristics. It was the sound of old Appalachian ballad singing, unaccompanied female, at a comfortable and unhurried pace. I turned my recorder on. I carry a small digital voice recorder in my jacket pocket, as a matter of habit when I'm in the field. It's easier than taking written notes when my hands are occupied, and ambient audio can sometimes capture things that aren't consciously noticed in the moment. I turned it on, oriented myself toward the source of the singing, and began walking toward it. quietly, moving carefully through the leaf litter, the way you move when you don't want to interrupt something you want to observe. The singing continued as I walked. I closed the distance over several minutes. I was moving through the bend in the hollow, where the terrain curves and you lose the sight line to the upper section, navigating by sound. The voice was clear, the melody was continuous. I was at approximately 40 feet when the singing stopped, mid-phrase. Not at the end of a line, not at a cadence. In the middle of a melodic line, as if the singer had simply stopped between one syllable and the next, cut off cleanly, completely, and the hollow was immediately and absolutely quiet. The only sound the creek and the wind in the tops of the trees. I stopped walking. I waited, perhaps 5 minutes, in absolute stillness, listening for the singing to resume. It did not. Then I moved to the location I estimated the singing had been coming from, a flat area where the hollow widened slightly before the terrain rose again at the head of the drainage, and I looked for any indication of a person, gear, footprints in the muddy creek bank, any disturbance in the leaf litter consistent with a person having stood there. Nothing. The space was undisturbed. I walked the hollow for another hour. I checked both sides of the creek, both the slope and the flat. I went to the head of the drainage and worked back down. I did not find any indication of another person having been there. When I got home, I pulled up the audio from my recorder. I had 17 minutes of recording from my time at the site. I could identify my own footsteps, my own murmured notes to myself, the sound of the creek, the sound of the wind. I could identify the moment I turned around and began walking toward the singing, because you can hear the pattern of my footsteps change to a quieter, more deliberate pace. The singing is not on the recording. Not diminished, not partially captured, not audible with headphones, but not through speakers. It is not there. The ambient sound of the hollow is continuous and clear throughout the recording. The creek, the wind, my footsteps. One moment where a woodpecker is audible in the distance. The silence between those sounds is real silence, not the silence of a recording that has lost audio data. The recorder was functioning, and in the 6 minutes of recording that correspond to the period when I could hear the singing clearly, there is no singing. I've consulted with a colleague who has some audio engineering background. He examined the recording and found nothing anomalous about its technical characteristics. No dropout, no processing artifacts, no evidence of data loss or corruption. The recording is complete. It simply does not contain the sound I heard. There are explanations I've considered. Sound recording in narrow, hollow terrain can be directional in unexpected ways. The same walls that amplify and carry sound for a listener within the hollow can create dead zones for certain recording positions. This is true. I've considered whether my recorder in my jacket pocket was shielded from the sound in some way that my ears were not. I've thought about this for months, and I can construct a scenario in which it's possible, but I can't fully convince myself of it, because the recording captures other sounds at similar distances without difficulty. I went back to Whittleton Branch a month later with a colleague who is also a historian, someone I've worked with for 15 years, and whose judgment I trust entirely. I played her the recording at the site. She listened and she noted the gap. The 6 minutes of ambient sound with nothing additional in it. We sat with it for a long time. We talked about possible explanations. We did not reach one. I've asked around carefully since, not broadcasting the question, but raising it in contexts where local knowledge gets shared. Conversations with longtime residents of the area, with trail regulars, with people who know that section of the gorge well. I've been careful not to lead anyone toward the answer I experienced. I ask open questions about unusual things people have heard on that trail. 2 people have mentioned singing. One of them heard it years ago and had never discussed it with anyone. The other heard something they described as an old woman singing without words, which is a slightly different description, but not incompatible with what I experienced. Singing without words might mean the words were not distinct at the distance. Neither of them knew about each other. Neither of them knew about my experience. I keep coming back to the recording gap. Memory is fallible. Perception is fallible. The ways that the mind constructs and reconstructs experience are numerous and well documented, and I know all of them in the professional sense. But the recorder was running. The ambient sound is continuous. The 6 minutes during which I heard singing clearly and steadily, during which I oriented toward the sound and moved toward it and heard it stop mid-phrase. Those 6 minutes are on the recording as ordinary ambient forest sound with nothing in the vocal register. I don't have a framework for that. I've tried to build one. I can't. I still go to Whittleton Branch. It remains a research site, independent of this experience, and I'm not willing to let an anomalous experience I can't explain keep me out of a place that has genuine historical significance. I've been back 4 times in the year since, at different times and in different seasons. I haven't heard the singing again. The hollow is the hollow. The creek, the sandstone walls, the depression in the ground where something once stood, the old growth timber at the upper end. But I always turn the recorder on now, as soon as I get to the site. And I always listen to the recording when I get home. And I'm always aware of the moment when the ambient sound of the hollow sounds exactly like itself. Just ambient sound. Nothing added, nothing extra in the register where a voice would be. The absence of what isn't there. I'm aware of it every time, and I don't think that awareness is going to go away. I wrote it up in my research notes. Anomalous auditory experience, March, Whittleton Branch site. No corroborating evidence on recording. 2 independent accounts from other visitors of similar experiences. No explanation identified. That's the clinical notation, and it's accurate. The version I tell people I trust is this. Someone was singing in a hollow in the Red River Gorge in March, in the old way. The way people sang before amplification and recording existed to change it. And whatever they were, whatever continuity or echo or presence moved through that place and made that sound, they didn't want to be recorded. They didn't want to be found. And the hollow, whatever the hollow is, and has been for the centuries, that people have moved through it and built in it and left and been remembered and been forgotten. The hollow kept their secret. That's what I know. That's what the record says, such as it is. Draw from it what you will. That's all 13. If any of these hit close to home, if you recognize something in a story, if it reminded you of something that's happened to you, if you've driven past a certain ridge in a certain season and understood something you've never been able to explain, subscribe and stick around. We've got more submissions backed up than we know what to do with. Leave a comment if one of these resonated, or if you've got a piece of a story and you're not sure you're ready to send the whole thing yet. We read those too. See you in the next one.